Thank you very much. Welcome to the District of Squamish Committee of the Whole meeting for Tuesday, April 9th, 2024. My name is Andrew Hamilton, and I am the Councillor Andrew Hamilton, acting as chair for this meeting. First, welcome to the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. We are absolutely pleased to be conducting our business, living, playing, and generally just loving this place. And we recognize that being here, we share this territory, we share this space with people who have been here long before. Please be advised that this council meeting is being live streamed, recorded, and will be available to the public to view on the District of Squamish website following the meeting. If you have concerns, please notify the corporate officer present at the meeting. Corporate officer is Carrie Wells. Okay. So first, look for a motion for adoption of the agenda, moved by Councillor French, second by Mayor Herford. Any opposed? None opposed, motion carries. On to our first item, staff reports, item 3I, Bill 44, small scale multi-unit housing zoning bylaw update. I'll leave it to staff to introduce themselves and bring up their presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Committee of the Whole. My name is Brian Daly, planner with Community Planning. With me is Jesse Fletcher, manager of Current Planning. Today we're here to present draft zoning bylaw amendments related to the changes required by the province through Bill 44. In November 2023, the province of British Columbia introduced Bill 44, small-scale multi-unit housing, which requires qualifying municipalities in the province to amend zoning bylaws in order to increase the minimum density standards by allowing more small-scale multi-unit housing options in land use zones that are otherwise restricted to single-family dwellings or duplexes. Bill 44 aims to increase housing supply, create diverse housing choices, and over time, contribute to more affordable and attainable housing across BC. Local governments must update their zoning bylaws by June 30th, 2024 to align with Bill 44. The Squamish Housing Action Plan, funded through CMHC's Housing Accelerator Fund, includes several initiatives that overlap with Bill 44. Staff have drafted zoning bylaw amendments based on the recommendations provided in the provincial policy guidance on Bill 44. The provincial policy guidance is to make zoning regulations as flexible as possible to facilitate the development of these new forms of housing. Bylaw number 3036/2024 proposes to replace the RS1, RS1A, RS2, RS2A, RS3, and RMH2 zoning in the majority of the district with a new R1 zone. Areas subject to high flood hazard or debris flow hazard are not subject to this amendment, and staff are seeking an exemption to the Bill 44 requirements to increase density in these areas. Staff will bring forward appropriate zoning bylaw amendments for these areas as part of a separate update to the zoning bylaw, as this involves a significant amount of work with a flood hazard consultant that cannot be completed prior to the June 30th deadline. This slide shows the approximate areas that we anticipate to be exempted from the Bill 44 requirements. Highlights of the amendments include adding a definition of multiple dwelling residential, which means a physical arrangement of 3 or more attached dwelling units. Multiple dwelling residential is included as a permitted use in the new R1 zone, as are single unit and 2-unit dwellings. Section 4.5, which regulates secondary suites, is amended to revise the language regarding where secondary suites are permitted to note they are permitted in a single unit or 2-unit dwelling, as opposed to referencing zoning that permits a single unit dwelling use. There are properties in the district that contain existing single unit dwellings that have zoning that does not permit this use. For example, in Wilson Crescent, where there is multiple unit residential zoning, and under the current regulations would not be able to add a secondary suite in their home. Section 4.38, which regulates accessory dwelling units, is amended to reduce the required setbacks and increase the permitted height from 6.7 meters to 8 meters. This will increase design flexibility for accessory dwelling units. Section 4.39, multi-unit flex unit, is amended to make explicit that they are permitted in a multiple unit residential dwelling unit, townhouse, or apartment dwelling unit, and remove references to the zones that permit this use. Section 4.52, small-scale multi-unit housing, has been added to the general regulations to permit a two-unit dwelling in any comprehensive development zone or rural residential zone that permits a single-unit dwelling, is serviced by municipal water and sanitary services, and is not located within the agricultural land reserve. This is intended to meet the provincial requirement by allowing up to 4 dwelling units, a two-unit dwelling with a secondary suite on each side, to meet the provincial requirement. Staff have taken this approach with comprehensive development and rural residential zones to ensure provincial requirements are being met without modifying those zones, because that approach presents an administrative challenge. Given that CD zones were drafted for specific developments, there's a risk that applying the R1 zone to certain areas of these zones would create unintended nonconformance with zoning. There are a limited number of rural residential properties in the district that would meet the above noted criteria, most of which are located in the Loggers East neighborhood, which has recently completed a neighborhood plan and are likely to redevelop with higher densities than permitted in R1. Excuse me. Thanks. A new zone, Residential 1, will be added to the zoning bylaw and will replace RS1, RS2, and RS3 zoning in the majority of the district. Permitted uses in the R1 zone include single-unit dwelling, two-unit dwelling, and multiple dwelling residential use. The minimum lot size requirements in R1 remain the same as in RS1 and RS2. The maximum height for a single unit or two-unit dwelling remains the same as in RS1 and RS2 at 9 meters. The maximum height for multiple dwelling residential is 11 meters or 3 stories, whichever is less, which is based on the recommendations in the provincial policy guidance. Maximum lot coverage for a single or two-unit dwelling remains the same at 33%, but increases to 40% if the single unit or two-unit dwelling contains a suite and an accessory dwelling unit. Lot coverage increases to 50% for multiple dwelling residential use, which is aligned with provincial policy guidance. Density in the R1 zone allows for 4 strata-titled multiple dwelling residential units on a lot and allows for an additional 5th dwelling unit if it is provided as a secondary suite, multi-unit flex unit, or accessory dwelling unit. This additional unit cannot be stratified, which is intended to incentivize a rental unit on the property. The proposed maximum floor area ratios are summarized on this slide. The floor area ratios in the R1 zone increase based on the number of units proposed, with a bonus FAR available if a secondary suite or multi-unit flex unit or ADU is provided. A maximum unit size of 220 square meters is included for multiple dwelling residential use. Staff have reviewed existing triplexes in the district and other jurisdictions who have drafted their Bill 44 zoning, which informed the 0.8 to 1.0 FAR. Provincial policy guidance does not recommend including an FAR for the Bill 44 changes. However, staff feel that it is prudent to apply an FAR in the initial rollout of the regulations after reviewing existing townhome developments through the district and their respective densities. Should staff see issues related to the proposed FAR once applications start being processed, the FARs can be amended in the future. The minimum setbacks in the R Zone 1 are as follows. Front setback is 3 meters, rear setback is 3 meters, interior side setback is 1.2 meters, and exterior side setback is 3 meters. Provincial policy guidance recommends a minimum front setback of 2 meters and a minimum rear setback of 1.5 meters. Given that the majority of the properties in the district abut a secondary floodway, staff are recommending a 3-meter front setback, which can be reduced to 2 meters for an accessory dwelling unit. Staff have engaged a consultant to determine whether a 2 to 3 meter setback is sufficient to maintain flood conveyance for secondary floodways. The front setback may need to be adjusted based on the outcome of this work, which is anticipated to be completed prior to bringing the proposed bylaws for readings. Common usable open space is not required in the R1 zone. Staff are proposing a minimum private usable open space requirement of an equivalent of at least 10% of the gross floor area of the dwelling unit to be provided as private usable open space for multiple dwelling residential use. The 10% requirement mirrors the current private open space requirement in multiple unit residential zones, such as RM1 to RM3. There is an option to provide this same amount of area required for private usable open space as common usable open space to provide increased design flexibility. The second zoning bylaw amendment associated with the Bill 44 update is related to proposed parking reductions. Bylaw 3035 proposes the following amendments: eliminating off-street parking requirements for secondary suites, accessory dwelling units, and multi-unit flex units. This is recommended in the provincial policy guidance and supported by staff as a way to continue to incentivize infill rental housing. There's a risk that without any incentive to provide a suite, properties will redevelop with the maximum number of stratified units and no longer provide secondary suites, reducing the number of new opportunities for rental units in neighborhoods. It also proposes to include a parking requirement of 1 space per principal dwelling unit for multiple dwelling residential use. Provincial policy guidance is to set a maximum parking requirement of 1 space per dwelling unit, but staff are recommending a more conservative approach. Staff believe that the market will continue to provide parking that exceeds this requirement where practical, as units with additional parking are typically more attractive and may sell for a higher amount. As part of the Squamish Housing Action Plan, staff are committed to exploring parking solutions, including eliminating and reducing parking requirements as part of the district's Housing Accelerator Fund commitment. As the Bill 44 zoning update is required by the province of BC, staff are implementing an informed level on the IAP2 participation spectrum. Staff will amend the draft zoning bylaw amendments based on committee feedback and conduct public engagement on the amendments prior to bringing the bylaws forward for readings. I will now pass it over to Jesse to finish the presentation.
Thank you, Brian. So this project is part of the Squamish Housing Accelerator Plan and is fulfilling 2 of 9 sectors, which are highlighted in red on the screen. Specifically, it is aiming to fulfill our Bill 44 requirements in relation to permitting up to 4 units by right in existing single-family zones. It also seeks to facilitate the construction of accessory dwelling units and secondary suites by removing parking requirements, which is a Housing Accelerator Fund commitment. Thank you. The Missing Middle Housing Accelerator seeks to accelerate missing middle housing. So that's primarily where Bill 44 falls. This slide highlights that this year, we also aim to remove ADP review of multiplexes. Next year, staff will continue to explore parking solutions and the possibility of the sixplex form in areas well served by transit. The ADU program seeks to facilitate more ADUs within the community. This year, to meet this strategy, we've engaged in a design competition and propose to exempt ADUs from DCCs in our DCC bylaw update later this year. Today, we're recommending removing parking requirements for accessory dwelling units, which is a half commitment. So this slide just highlights all the ongoing work as part of the SHAP. So above you see the Bill 44 in the red box. So today we're at committee and we have a June deadline to pass these bylaw changes. So we'll be doing public engagement at the end of the month and then come back based on council feedback for readings in May.
So staff are seeking committee feedback on the draft zoning bylaw amendments related to Bill 44. And with that, that concludes our presentation. We're happy to take questions at this time.
Thank you very much. Council. Mayor Herford.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for breaking this into what feels like bite-sized pieces for us to tackle. I'm curious around the accessory dwelling units and the height changes, and how that relates. I see some inconsistency with the sort of the new allowable heights in RS1, given that the same number of floors I think are available. Or can you? I guess what's that height to be used for in the ADU? Maybe I'll start there.
Through the chair, it is essentially intended to provide increased design flexibility for accessory dwelling units to create more, well, yeah, exactly that, more design flexibility to potentially allow for more livable ADUs and potentially increased in size to, you know, the majority of the district is located in a floodplain. So staff felt it was appropriate to look at options for really trying to increase the design flexibility to continue to incentivize this form of housing. Given that a number of new stratified units are allowed through this, staff really wanted to find ways to increase the design flexibility and continue to incentivize them.
Okay, so in other instances where we've had some height variances recently, we've been ensuring sort of like the garage height being functional, but that's not the driver of this particular increase. It's the overall flexibility of the design.
That's correct.
Okay, so I'm curious about the if the FAR isn't quite right, and if staff sees a problem with, it can be amended in future, I think was how it was presented. We know that when the problem emerges, you can see my air quotes, those applications would need to be treated under those regulations. So I'm sort of challenged by this concept rather than sort of opening it up gradually, why we're going sort of more, I guess, more aggressive or more open there. And then we need to live collectively with the mistakes for the time of the life of the building rather than starting less and maybe moving forward. Just can you speak to the tension, how you arrived at this particular piece?
Through the chair, so staff reviewed existing triplexes and throughout that have been constructed throughout the district, and as well as other zoning bylaws that were proposed in other jurisdictions. I believe only Burnaby was the only local government that did not include an FAR in their new zoning update. So staff thought it was prudent to apply an initial FAR. While it may seem high, staff thought that this was appropriate, and also including a maximum unit size would not necessarily, on a larger property, you wouldn't necessarily be able to achieve the maximum 1.0 because you're still limited by this unit size. So staff thought that was a way to kind of have a cautious rollout related to the FARs, but also allow for design flexibility on smaller properties, because there is quite a diverse range of lot sizes throughout the district. So it's kind of hard to stick with one FAR for the whole district. So that was the rationale for staff's approach with the proposed FARs and including a maximum unit size.
Okay. Yeah, that makes some sense. I wonder about the minimum lot size, and just if you could speak to that. There's a lot of talk about stratification with the style of construction, and I wonder about some of our bigger lots. If like it's unchanged from, is that right, for the minimum lot size, and is that what you were working from with the FARs and so on?
Yes, that's correct. The minimum lot size remains the same from RS1 and RS2.
Okay, my last question, if I can, Chair, for now, is the flood hazard piece. You showed, I think it was Schedule D of the OCP. Schedule D2 is a little bit more granular and shows the limited densification areas and so on. So I'm trying to understand how will all those areas be treated? I get that was a general overview, but will those other categories of flood risk be captured in this as well, or is that not a risk based off the changes that you're proposing with the FAR and those other checks and balances here?
Through the chair, those areas will also be addressed through this work with the flood consultant. Staff are just trying to get kind of a very general map to highlight this, but the work with the flood consultant will inform where the areas are going to be exempt, and then staff will have to bring forward separate zoning for those areas.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. I've got Councillor Stoner and then Councillor Pettingill.
Thank you. Through the chair, thanks staff for bringing this forward. Despite it being in bite-sized pieces, it still feels complicated. And I think one of the things that I continue to struggle with, as we did, I think, with the affordable housing rezoning, is just really understanding the relationship between the changes in the setbacks and the heights and the floor area ratios. And so I don't know if staff are able to bring back, when this comes back, some general depiction of this is what it would mean in terms of a higher building on a regular size lot with the increased setbacks or the reduced setbacks. So that's just one thing that's in my mind as I'm trying to pull these pieces together. But on the floor area ratio, the provincial policy guidance suggests not to include a floor area ratio for a number of reasons. One that I find reasonable is that they say it will discourage the development of excessively large and expensive single-family dwellings that could be illegally converted to multi-unit dwellings to avoid cost and regulatory processes. So I'm just wondering why staff feel like including the floor area ratio at this point is a useful approach.
Through the chair, essentially staff thought it was appropriate to include this in the initial rollout because, or in order to avoid unintended consequences. And if we started with nothing, it would be quite hard to go back and then put in a floor area ratio after. We thought it would be prudent to take a more cautious approach and apply a floor area ratio in the initial rollout and see how that goes, and see what forms of housing end up being developed. And should there be challenges associated with that, staff thought we could amend it in the future. But as you noted, it is very hard to visualize or conceptualize what all of these regulations are going to look like with reduced setbacks and no floor area ratio, and how that's going to integrate into existing neighborhoods.
So I think building on that, we do have a number of lots that in the subsequent to the last OCP update, we actually did allow for up to triplexes on corner lots, predominantly on the west side of the highway. What lessons have we learned there? Because from my understanding, not many of those lots have actually been converted into triplexes, in part because of cost. I think also because of some of the restrictions on design. So what lessons have we looked at in terms of reflection from 2018 to now on the units that do allow for triplexes or greater?
Through the chair, I actually do have a couple slides here. If I can share my, oh, it went away. Sorry. That would be some good examples. Apologies. So this is an existing triplex that is located in Brackendale. It is an 860 square meter parcel. It has a 0.5 floor area ratio, a 25% lot coverage, and the average unit size is 1,550 square feet. So as you can see, this met the maximum floor area ratio in the existing RS2 zone, but it didn't even take advantage of the full lot coverage. The next example is a duplex with suites on each side and an accessory dwelling unit, also located in Brackendale. The lot coverage is 33%. The floor area ratio was almost maxed out in this at 0.5, and each unit is approximately 3,000 square feet on each side, or 270 square meters. That does include a suite, and the parcel size is 1,400 square meters. So these are just two examples. And I believe, I'm not sure if council is familiar, there's also another triplex going up on the corner of Depot and Government, which is quite large. So staff thought it was prudent to, in the initial rollout, to have a floor area ratio and a maximum unit size, just to, allow for design flexibility, but also, ensure that there, in the initial rollout, there aren't too many unintended consequences.
Through the chair, if I can add, so some of those lessons, what Brian has highlighted here is that the lots where we're seeing them succeed are much larger. So a higher FAR and a smaller lot is important for them to achieve a similar unit size. The unit size seems to be driving very much the ability to build these triplexes. Also, the other constraint that we often see is parking, whereas on smaller lots, the need to get 2 stalls per unit is often the breaking point, especially since we only allow 1 driveway. So we've seen them try to be built on corner lots with a lane, but they still require 3 accesses to get 6 cars onto the lot. So by reducing parking standards, we're hoping to increase that flexibility. Same with the setbacks for specifically those smaller lots. So in areas like Dentville, Valleycliffe, downtown, they're often quite constrained.
Thank you for that. And thanks for having some examples. That helps flesh it out a little bit in my brain. It did raise another question, though. The examples that you provide were all in Brackendale, which all fall within the area that you said this would not apply to because of the limited densification and the debris flow hazard. So can you speak to why we would allow it now, but we're not going to allow it going forward?
Through the chair, these examples are forms of housing that are currently permitted under the RS2 zoning. So that the flood hazard work is not necessarily saying that we would not allow that for those forms of housing there. It's just staff need to do more work to understand if it's appropriate and aligned with the flood hazard policies. But yes, it seems that the majority of the places where Brackendale has large lots, and this is where it has been successful for triplexes to be constructed.
So more work to be done to figure out which places in Brackendale it may or may not apply to.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Pettingill. Yeah, thanks. A couple things to Councillor Stoner's point. It would be good to just understand a little better the impact of the setbacks and the height and the FAR, and just because when I read this, it seemed like we were enabling McMansions possibly, and it wasn't quite clear to me. And so, just a better understanding of that when this comes back would be helpful. I did wonder, and I understand a lot of this seems to be focused on smaller lots, so maybe rental zoning isn't appropriate. But I did sort of wonder. Um, and maybe that is the answer, but is there a reason why sort of rental zoning or that sort of tool hasn't been contemplated as part of this too, rather than other tools to make sure everything doesn't just stratify?
Through the chair, rental zoning has been considered at this time as it's a fairly complicated tool to use for this number of units, and it may result as a disincentive to redevelopment under these new regulations. It's probably more appropriate on kind of larger projects where you're dealing with an apartment building with a number of units where you'd apply rental zoning. There may be a future project where you'd look at density bonus to incentivize rental housing. Staff did come up with the additional unit as a form of trying to incentivize a rental unit on the property, and hopefully folks take advantage of that.
Okay, and then just wondering how what's proposed here aligns or doesn't align or negates our low carbon incentive. Do we lose that when we implement this, or what happens there?
Through the chair, the low carbon incentive will be captured through the update to the building bylaw for the low carbon step code.
So does that mean like I understand there's the low carbon step code where we can set an emissions intensity, but we also had a thing in relation to, shrinking the buildable, I think it was FAR or buildable size. And then if you committed to no gas, you could build bigger. I think, is that going away and we're just replacing it with the low carbon?
That is my understanding.
Oh, yes, Mr. Valaniskas.
Thank you. Through the chair, yeah, I can confirm that is the plan, is to get away from having it regulated in the zoning bylaw and located it all in the building bylaw, because we have those tools now, which we didn't have when the zoning changes were made.
Okay, thanks. Just a comment then. For me, there's still a little bit of lack of clarity in terms of smaller buildings. Even if you're at the max, can you still try and justify putting gas infrastructure in your home, which I think is a problem. It's not just the intensity number. It's, are we putting fossil fuel infrastructure into new homes? So if there's any mechanism, for example, I don't know if this is the right term, but a partial amenity zoning or something, other tool we can use to make sure we're not getting new fossil infrastructure, new building, I think that would be helpful to me. And I think the planet and our survival. But the last piece is parking. And right now we have no maximum, we have minimums, which I think is 2 cars per unit generally. We're talking about going down to 1 car per unit minimum. I'm just wondering why, as a middle ground, we didn't say, okay, we're not going to add a maximum, but we will take away the minimum. And why we went for a 1 car minimum as opposed to just say no mins and maxes, and that'll be our middle ground.
Through the chair, just to clarify, the 1 stall per unit is only applicable to the multiple dwelling residential use. Staff have left the single unit and 2 unit dwelling at 2 stalls, and then staff are proposing to eliminate the parking requirement for suites and carriage houses in order to try and use that as a tool to incentivize those still being provided on properties. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Jesse.
Thanks, Brian. Through the chair, the province recommends a maximum of 1 based on our situation, parking stall per unit, but there are considerations from engineering about future on-street parking and the fact that the new street state standards will have very little on-street parking. So by still requiring 1 stall, we can kind of offset the on-street impact of removing required parking.
Okay, and then just the last question on this topic. My understanding of the $7 million grant we got, and I can't remember what it was called,
but that a piece of that was being pretty aggressive in terms of reducing parking requirements. Are we on side with that, or just someone, more importantly, maybe the grantor, do they validate or give us feedback on whether or not we're pushing far enough on some of the commitments we made in the grant?
Through the chair, the part of the commitment in the Housing Accelerator Fund grant was to reduce parking. There is a project that will be following this one, looking at sixplexes and reduced parking along frequent transit networks to align with what will be our future frequent transit network pending funding. We do check in with CMHC on our half commitments, and they will give feedback. At this time, this is aligned with what we've committed in the short term.
Thanks very much, Councillor Pettingill. I have Councillor French next.
Thanks, Chair. There's one part of the existing bylaw that caught my eye, and it's a reference to Lot 38, Blocks 18 and 19, District Lots 515. I tried to find that property, that lot, that area, and those are difficult to search. What is that property? Why is it noted? What makes it?
Through the chair, those were, if you recall, in the recent zoning bylaw update, there was the parcel at the end of Perth Drive and the one on Maple Drive in Valleycliffe, where we restricted subdivision and allowed up to a fourplex on each of those. Those are the legal descriptions of those two parcels.
Okay, mystery solved. Thank you.
All right, and before we go to second round of questions, I have a couple of my own. First is a very simple clarification. Is a secondary floodway an engineering word for a ditch?
No, it is a actual secondary floodway. So in the event of a flood, it is where the floodwaters are intended to flow. There's primary floodways and secondary floodways. Most roads are secondary floodways in the district.
Got it. Thanks. It was taking my, anyways, trying to think of this word applying to the whole district. And okay. Second question is on, I think this is more of a how we're rolling this out from a bylaw perspective. I noted the R1 zone as proposed lacks quite a few of the permitted uses that is included in the RS1 zone. So are those permitted uses going to be added to the R1 zone? I can list a few of them if it's helpful. Yeah. So pull it up once so for example, in the RS1 zone, permitted uses, childcare facility, home occupation, STR, subject to provisions, and I don't see those in the R1 zone.
Yes, through you, Chair. Those are all regulated in the general regulations. They were just duplicated in the RS1 zone, so it's not necessary to call them out.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And second question, another question on how this is going to roll out. First question, do DCCs apply to MDRs?
Yes, they will.
And do ACCs or will ACCs apply to MDRs?
I believe they will, yes. We're still in the process of developing that bylaw, but it is likely that they will apply to that.
Will ACCs and DCCs apply if with any expansion? So if you go from a single dwelling unit to a two dwelling unit on a lot, will ACCs and DCCs apply, or is it only for that threshold to MDR?
I don't have enough information on that project to answer that question at this time, but Jonas.
I could answer it. ACCs, our understanding, and it's new legislation, so it's a bit limited, but our understanding is that ACCs will be calculated the same way the DCCs are calculated, which is any additional unit. So if the property, say, was developed as a single family home and goes to a duplex, you have to pay for that additional unit. that hasn't been covered in the past in the previous building permit.
Thanks. And this additional DCC, sorry, getting into the weeds maybe, but the additional ACC and DCC does not apply if you're doing an accessory dwelling unit. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
So that's further incentivization for rental accessory dwelling units. And yeah, Councillor Stoner.
Our current DCC bylaw does apply to ADUs though. Is that not correct? The proposal is that we would remove that fee going forward in a future update.
That is our commitment, but I believe that we've already done that in the last DCC update, haven't we?
I believe so. I think it's silent on accessory dwelling units, so it is not charged, if I recall correctly.
That's correct. Essentially, in the past we've had it added as a specific type of dwelling unit, and I believe our current bylaw does not define what an accessory dwelling unit is, and so it only applies to dwelling units, which an accessory dwelling unit in DCC terms is not.
And if I may add, that sounds confusing, but the legislation is very specific about what you can exempt DCCs from. It has to be, I believe, affordable rental housing, not for profit rental housing or energy efficient housing, and so on. But it doesn't specifically call out accessory dwelling units, so I don't think you can exempt them through the bylaw. If it's silent on it, it is essentially an exemption. That's my understanding.
It's maybe not entirely pertinent to this conversation. We can go back and double check, but my understanding is that we brought it back in because for a long time we did exempt ADUs and then they were being used as short-term rental units. And so we brought it back into the DCC bylaw because people were making more profit off of them as short-term rentals as opposed to long-term rentals. And then for a while we covenanted ADUs so that you couldn't do short-term rentals before we had short-term rental regulation. Anyways, I'd be curious to know where the ADUs currently sit in the DCC bylaw and some of the rationale behind why we may or may not exempt them.
We can bring that information back for council at the next opportunity when we come back with bylaws.
Thanks very much. Another question, and I think this is more of a clarification following on Councillor Pettingill's questions. I recognize that the low carbon step code is meant to reduce gas infrastructure within residential units or within building. Is it possible to require no gas in our building bylaw?
That's a great question. The bylaw cannot specifically, or the building code does not allow municipalities to say you can't use any gas. We have to follow the zero carbon step code, which allows us to apply greenhouse gas intensity targets to to different types of occupancies. So say residential is one of them. And really low intensity targets essentially just recognize the presence of greenhouse gases in our electrical grid. So that is what we can do through the building bylaw, but there are constraints around it. We can't just say no gas.
And where does that rule come from? At what level of legislative ability does that come from? Is that provincial?
That's correct. It's provincial. Yeah, it's under the Building Act.
I'd appreciate further clarity. This is for me to understand if it's possible to pull out where in the Building Act that, if you could get us that information, where in the Building Act that sits, so we can have clarity on what is possible and what is not possible regarding fossil fuel infrastructure in our building code.
We will be bringing this for consideration because we are currently running that project of implementing the zero carbon step code in our building bylaw. So we can do that, I think, perhaps a better venue than in the zone discussion is to cover that off in those conversations, because we'll have the staff who are running that project.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. So that's it for me. Going around to second round of questions. Mayor Herford?
Yeah, thank you. The ADU piece, I'm struggling with the height. I think the carriage house above the garage that we've seen make sense, but considering that we're looking at these other categories where there's the elevated cottage and front yard ADU, to me those don't warrant the same height piece, given that there's not parking underneath. We're not trying to fight with we're not sort of in conflict with the flood control levels and so on. And just can you speak to the rationale there? To me, a cottage isn't 8 meters tall. It feels like it's a bunk. It feels more like it's like the similar square footage that you'd have above the garage in the carriage house, but it only needing to deal with a meter of flood control or something more manageable. So I'm just challenged by these sort of definitions of ADUs and this height piece that's being sort of blanketed across them.
Through the chair, again, this is really intended to try and provide an increased design flexibility for this form of housing. You could do, outside of the floodplain, you could do an 8 meter tall carriage home with living space on both floors. And this would provide an opportunity for perhaps, if a family owns a property and they wanted to build a home for their kids or other family members on site and live there and rent it out. This is really intended to really try and increase the design flexibility to see what other forms of ADUs might pop up. Presently you pretty much have to put it above a garage to get that increased height. So you're looking at kind of a pretty small, maybe a 2-bedroom rental unit. So this is intended to allow for increased design flexibility, just to see what forms of ADUs are possible with this increased design flexibility.
Through the chair, to just add on to that, one of the considerations that we looked at was in areas where there was no flood construction level that was significantly high. So there was normally no garage at the ground level, but they were often constrained by lot coverage. By allowing floor area over 2 areas, you might get a smaller building and less impact on lot coverage, which is where the excess height comes in hand. Generally speaking, zoning bylaws that do allow 2 stories, residential buildings, 8 meters is the max. It allows for more design flexibility. At 6.7 meters, you can really only comfortably fit the garage on the ground floor, and then living space on the second floor. So it still does constrain the form.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And I'm looking forward to seeing the results of the ADU design competition to help me visualize some of these, if nothing else. But also, okay, and on the flood piece, I understand the additional work required. Can you remind me the timeline of that additional work so we can understand the impacts of the flood controls and so on?
Through the chair, my understanding is we are anticipating having at least the information related to the setbacks completed to inform the zoning bylaw update that has to get completed by June 30th. In terms of the timeline for the rest of the work, it will likely be brought forward in the fall. Is that correct, Jesse?
Through the chair, that's correct. We're hoping to get the letter for the province and the information on the setbacks sooner. But in order for us to respond to what we understand in limited areas and what can be done, that work's going to take more time.
Okay, but sometime this year is the projection. This isn't year 3 of a multi-year project that this is.
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. Back to Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, just a couple quick notes. One, it caught my ear the attention that we could waive DCCs or ACCs for, I think, the was mentioned energy efficient buildings. So I'm just wondering if that's an opportunity, maybe with reduced, to plug any gaps with the zero carbon step code if we find them. And I do want to note sort of, I am concerned about the timing of when the zero carbon step code comes versus when we implement this. And I would not like to leave a gap where there's sort of an opportunity for a few months or a year or two to put in fossil infrastructure. So maybe even if there's a quick and dirty zero carbon thing, if that's what is required to get this over the hump in time for June. Another timing related thing, I'm wondering, I know what we're trying to do here is incentivize more development. But, a lot of these things we're talking about here theoretically could have been granted to a developer in exchange for some CACs. And so I'm sort of wondering a little bit about the opportunity cost. I mean, arguably they aren't developing much, so you aren't missing an opportunity. But, in some cases they did develop things. We captured possibly some affordable units or other things. I assume we'll try and capture that with the ACC bylaw to the degree we can in the future. But I'm just wondering, if staff see a risk, are we going to miss out on, just with all the work we have to do? Is there, a significant lag with the ACC bylaw that we're going to miss some sort of key opportunities to capture some of those things we would have otherwise with CACs? And again, maybe it's just our reality, but I'm trying to just wrap my head around the magnitude of that or the timelines or how these things would align. If there's anything you can speak to that.
Through the chair, I think that the reality is that some CACs will be missed through this process. That's just the reality given the timelines and the ACC bylaw work, but it's pretty hard to speculate on what that might look like because I think this is the first look that everyone is getting at the new regulations. So they won't even be in place until June. And then, development applications have to be prepared. They have to go through the process. So it's likely some will be missed, but I can't really comment on the magnitude. I suspect it won't be a very high amount, but if you'd like to add to that, Jesse.
Through the chair, I think an important consideration on this in terms of are we missing redevelopment potential by already zoning is that we haven't seen a lot of applications for infill housing. Generally speaking, through speaking to many land economists while we were contemplating this project, the land lift on such a rezoning is so small that the time in the process generally makes it too high of a risk to proceed on that. So by pre-zoning essentially for inclusive housing, where you take that risk out and there's more of a chance that we'll see this type of housing be developed. The other consideration through speaking with land economists, was that generally the people that we will see pursue this are going to be families who are looking to build additional units for their extended family on a lot, so they'll already own the properties. It's less likely that we'll see developers moving forward to try to build this, again, given that the land lift is so small and there's quite a bit of risk involved.
Thanks very much. Councillor Stoner?
Thanks. Just following up on Councillor Penningill's question, our CAC policy doesn't actually apply though above or for projects below a certain threshold, right?
Through the chair, it does. Essentially, any rezoning that adds additional dwelling units would be subject to the CAC policy. It just has different calculation mechanisms for smaller projects versus bigger.
And we'll still be able to collect DCCs on any of the new builds as per our current DCC bylaw. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification. I wanted to go back, Ms. Fletcher, to the floor area ratio conversation and one of your comments that said the biggest change that we see is actually the relationship between the lot size and the floor area ratio in terms of making these viable. So on the bigger lots is where we're actually seeing, but the proposed bylaw varies the floor area ratio with the number of units, not the lot size. And so I just wonder if we've considered that.
Through the chair, yes. So currently the floor area ratio for a duplex, I believe, is 0.45. So to go to a triplex and a fourplex plus suite, you could go up to 1.0. So we are increasing the overall floor area ratio, so there is more available with the minimum unit size of 220. So we think a triplex then on a smaller lot would be viable based on our lot size of 6,000 square feet. So we were looking at lot size and incentivizing the triplex and the fourplex, whereas the duplex may still not be viable on the smaller lots.
Thank you for that. And then I'm curious, what is the threshold for requiring frontage improvements? So like is it a triplex that triggers it? Is it a fourplex? Is it depending on lot? Yeah. When do those costs incur?
Through the chair. So anytime a building permit application is submitted or a subdivision application, it triggers the subdivision and development control bylaw. And then engineering staff, I believe, are currently working on a policy on specifically specifying when the frontage improvements are being required. I think presently, or in the past, it hasn't been triggered for single unit dwelling construction, but on larger duplexes or triplexes, it has. So that work is ongoing, and more clarification will probably be provided on that in the future. To answer your question, though, anytime you submit a building permit application, technically the engineering department can request frontage improvements.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting piece to all this. And then just to clarify, ADUs can't be stratified or sold, right? They are basically required to be part of the existing ownership structure and or rented.
That's correct.
And then finally, my other question was just around the informed level of engagement here and what happens next. So we are on a timeline that has been set by the province. It is my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we aren't actually allowed to go to public hearing on this zoning bylaw. And so what is our level if folks do have feedback, especially I think our building community, as well as just general concerns that will probably arise through the community. What is our level of engagement there, and what's people's opportunity to provide feedback on the functionality of these bylaws?
Through the chair, staff are going to hold an open house event at the end of the month, and that will be an opportunity, and we'll reach out to the local building community and other folks and advertise it in the newspaper and on the e-news, and then folks can attend this event and learn more about the changes and solicit feedback. And then obviously the community can submit written comment as they would for any other zoning bylaw amendment, and that will be presented to council as part of the zoning bylaw package when it comes for readings.
Thank you very much. Councillor Pettingill, did I have another one?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the frontage improvements, because I have had would-be developers ask me about or speak to the challenge with those. Is that the sort of thing where with the ACC changes and so on, that those could be captured in DCCs or ACCs as opposed to some other mechanism? Or just do we know?
Through the chair, I will take a stab with my understanding, and then Jonas, if you want to add anything. So the DCC bylaw is based on identified projects, and those are costed out. And there's, a ratio for existing folks and new development, and then you pay your DCCs when you get your building permit. Frontage improvements can be required through the subdivision and development control bylaw. So anytime you submit a building permit or subdivision, staff can request that you bring your current frontage up to the standards in the bylaw. So it is separate from the DCC bylaw. I suppose if you were doing some sort of, let's say you needed to upgrade the water main for fire flows or something like that for your project, then maybe you wouldn't have to pay the DCCs related to water for that project, but they're separate items.
All right, thank you very much. Any more questions from council before we go to comments? No, okay. Comments for feedback comments. I'll start on my right here with Councillor Stoner, and we'll go clockwise.
Thanks for bringing this forward and for trying to help me wrap my head around what it's actually going to look like. I think that there inevitably will be some questions, lots of questions as this continues to roll out. But I think where we're landing is a rational place given the timeline that we have and the end goal that we're trying to achieve along with the province on these changes. A few things is I think going forward, a redlined version or at least a contextualized version of the bylaw update would be really helpful. What's in our package is really hard to understand what the actual zone will look like when we incorporate it into the zoning bylaw. And so I think especially in advance of any sort of public engagement on that, it'd be, I think it's really difficult for folks just to wrap their heads around what this looks like. So a redlined or contextualized version of the bylaw would be really helpful, as well as any, even if they're super simple schematics or examples of some of the ones that you brought up in committee of the whole today, Mr. Daly, so that folks can really just try and wrap their heads around what this means and what it might mean. I am not overly concerned about the height increase to the ADU, but I do think that some further contextualization of it, I think the trade-off between having a lower setback to the neighboring properties and increasing that height is somewhere where we might get some tension. And so just better understanding that relationship and being able to justify it to the public will be important. And I think with regards to the parking standards, what staff are proposing is a good middle ground. I think it doesn't go quite as far as the province would like us to, but I think the reality of our community and some of the limitations that we'll have with off-site street parking over time, I think this helps balance that out. So generally supportive of the direction that it's going. Thanks.
Mayor Herford.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I agree with Councillor Stoner as far as as much as we can to contextualize this, whether that's in how the regulations presented. I do appreciate staff coming with the extra slides, anticipating the questions around, what does this look like? But like my questions around the height of the ADUs, for instance, and how all this interacts with the FARs, some rough conceptualization there would be great, given that we know we need to change. So it's not that status quo is is an option in this scenario, but just understanding what this could really look like would be great. I don't know what a standard lot looks like for this quick sketch for that visualization, given all the variables, but some additional help visualizing that would be great. I think the parking strikes a good balance, and isn't seen maybe in this context to be as aggressive as it could be, but I think that our community is going to view it as being quite aggressive, and to live up to sort of the aspirations of the province. It does take a commitment from the province to fund things like transit expansion that we've been fighting tooth and nail for, to be able to justify even actions such as this, but certainly going further. So there's a lot of moving pieces here, and all of them need to move, in my opinion, to really get us to where we need to be. I was happy to hear about the flood piece and the timeline there. I think it's really important to give clarity to the community as soon as possible in these times of substantive change as these roll out. And I think I'll leave it there for now. So thank you. I look forward to next steps. And for me, mostly it's this visualization piece. Thank you.
Councillor Greenlaw.
I'm sorry. Technology and I don't super get along. Okay. Yeah, thanks for bringing all this information forward and trying to distill it in a way that we can digest. I appreciate that. I am curious to see what the public feedback will be on this, and in particular to Councillor Stoner's comments about the ADU setbacks and heights. I suspect we'll have quite a few comments about that, and of course about the parking. And on that note, in the spirit of herding cats, which is the conversation of parking. I realize there are differing opinions about parking on council, but I disagree with the approach of being more aggressive on the parking requirements. In my opinion, there should be at least one spot per dwelling unit, including auxiliary dwelling units. We're already having a lot of concern around the overflow parking options, and I think this direction will exacerbate this issue. And I'd like to echo Mayor Herford's comments about requiring transit expansion to kind of support some of these cutbacks to parking. Because right now, the reality is a lot of people are commuting to Vancouver to support the houses that they're buying in Squamish. And though ideally they can work in town, play in town, live in town, unfortunately, right now, without that regional transit piece, we are having households that almost require 2 vehicles, really, in a lot of cases. And I know I'm going to hear about this from another councillor member, but yeah. Okay, well, thank you for all that. Those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Greenlaw. Councillor French.
Thanks, Chair. And thank you to staff. In the spirit of March Madness, this looks to me like a project that is like full team, full court press all the time. And I can see some great work has gone into it very quickly. And I'm generally supportive of everything we've seen today. Floor area ratios, I'm comfortable with. Parking, the heights. I'm also supportive of more engagement within the parameters that have been given to us by the province, and not less. So as much engagement as we can. And I'm with Mayor Herford in being supportive of visuals. We really saw today how super helpful those visual representations are with the examples that we saw in Brackendale in particular. So very much looking forward to what comes next, and with the understanding that transit expansion and transit frequency are really important to this entire project in supporting the directions we're looking to go.
Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. My comments will be fairly general and will focus on the provincial policy background. Since 2021 in the Open Doors report, the expert panel on the future of housing supply and affordability report, I have seen and I continue to see a big city lens being applied by the provincial government, perhaps not even they're being aware of to the extent that they're applying a big city lens. Firstly, with respect to parking. I see in the provincial policy manual and site standards, all of the references and contexts referred to are big cities, even explicitly. Local government requirements often being dated and resulting in parking being substantially overbuilt. I think that's a big city lens. The cities and local governments referred to are Edmonton, Toronto, San Francisco, and Portland. I think that we need to realize that our context for supporting modal shifts are not comparable with large urban centers. I lived in the city of Vancouver for over 2 decades, and that's my personal experience. We need to understand why people own and use cars and trucks and be careful not to make assumptions or get ahead of ourselves. We can do real damage to our street safety and other environmental factors in our neighborhoods. Environment, I mean living environment in our neighborhoods and function of our streets. On to the related to this, I think that we have to understand that in Squamish, with our topography, we have quite a number of areas with difficult terrain and 1940s or 50s roads, and they simply cannot accommodate some of the, I'll just be heavy-handed here, the assumptions being made in provincial policy. We have to be careful about our local circumstances. We need made in Squamish solutions. The report, the frequently asked questions document the province has put out addresses protecting biodiversity and ecosystem health and focusing increased housing supply within existing urban areas critical to efficient use of land, preserving intact natural ecosystems. Well, what we've done in our Valley Bottom, just a couple of examples, 7 Peaks and parts of Loggers Lane East are and were ungulate winter range that will never be replaced. any local naturalist can point out the higher values of valley bottom habitat relative to the hillsides. Any naturalist here in Squamish. So these are general comments. I appreciate this, and I'll end up with heritage. We are not advancing our heritage strategy, and I hope that we can make progress on this before we confront some real issues with heritage properties and buildings. These are also addressed in the provincial policy manual and related documents. I find that they're applying a very broad brush, and the background to them is Kitsilano and not the individual houses at Wilson Crescent or Dentville that we might be concerned about. We do have property owners that are trying to make efforts to, in fact, through the introducing an ADU to support the maintenance and protection of heritage assets. And we should learn from them. We have a ways to go, but I think we have people, property owners in the community that are wanting to work with us and introduce solutions that are in fact in line with the province, but in ways that we need to come up with a made in Squamish perspective on that as well. So these are general comments. Most importantly, I'd like to emphasize my support for staff's approach on parking, taking a more conservative approach than what is being proposed by the province. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Councillor Pettingill?
Yeah, thanks. I look forward to the public engagement. I think, and I assume it will be there, but from my perspective, it'd be really important to have a lot of education for the public on the changes in the provincial requirements and also the grant requirements. I think that context is really important for the success of seeing some public support for this. I think we've spoken about understanding the setbacks, heights, unit count, and so on, lot coverage, and what does that actually mean? Does that facilitate McMansions, or is that really more tailored towards multi-unit, more affordable units? And I think another piece that's come up a few times over the last couple of years is, I know the building code largely dictates accessible units, but I'd like to understand how these changes will allow us to facilitate accessible units, especially in terms of flood hazard concerns. And so is there enough room for ramps and so on to make, if buildings have to be raised up for flood levels, or are we sort of designing in the fact that none of these can be accessible units? I think, yeah, that's something to pay attention to. I would not like to see us leave gaps, even for a short time frame, in the great low carbon work we've done as a municipality. And I would like to go further with parking. For me, that is a made in Squamish solution. We are a very outdoorsy, very active community. And so moving away from vehicles is something that we can do really well here. I think, you know, the question is, are we trying to respond to what people have been doing for the last 40 years, or are we trying to design for where we actually know we all need to go for survival? And so I don't see us and what the province is talking about as big city stuff. I think these are things that, for better or worse, we all have to figure out how to do. I do recognize that more parking work is being done soon, and it is a real challenge that we haven't had room for local transit expansion, which I see as the bigger obstacle here, not regional transit. But because we're doing more parking work in the near term, you know, I can live with these suggestions being made. And I also appreciate the possible incentive aspect for some of the rental units with what's contemplated right now in the parking changes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Pettingill. So some final comments and thoughts from my side. Thank you very much for the thorough presentation. This is a huge piece of work, and it is amazing how big an impact this change is going to have across our community. I sincerely hope that our community takes this opportunity to engage with us, give us feedback on it, clearly apply their mind to what changes are being applied and how we might make them more amenable to where the community wants to go. So from my side, I'd like to see more clarity on the ACC and the DCCs as being applied to all the various pieces here. I recognize that's a piece of work that's somewhat separate and might be on a slightly different timeline, but any clarity on that that we can have when we bring this back next time would be great. I'd also like to see, I also seek clarity on where the regulations on where are we, in what ways are we limited from applying a no gas requirement in our building bylaw? I'd like to understand exactly how we are limited there. Regarding the staff's approach to the FAR, the heights, and the setback, I completely support those approaches. I think it's quite sensible to apply and to have an FAR requirement, but have it quite large. I do agree, while I scratched my head about MDU versus single and double heights differences being there, I think I do rationalize it now, and I see why there's a difference. And while I do see potential concerns with setbacks being, particularly side setbacks, being as small as 1.2 meters, I do think that there are spaces in our community where that is certainly viable and justifiable. Regarding parking, I would support a no parking requirement more than a minimum requirement. And by that, I don't mean that we require that there no parking. I mean that we do not apply a requirement. I think we should allow people to purchase property without parking if they want. When we set a minimum requirement, we remove people's ability. We remove their freedom of choice from buying a piece of buying a condo, buying a strata without a parking lot, without a parking spot. And I think we should give people that choice. So regarding parking, I would like to see us go halfway between the maximum of one and minimum of one, and say no parking requirement at all. With that, I seek a motion.
I have one further comment, and I also am curious if staff have clarity on the parking thing, because I think there's a variety of feedback that I've heard from around the table that might be helpful for staff if we try and consolidate. But my additional comment that I had as my colleagues were speaking was, I don't know if this is possible, but to have any sense of the number of duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes that have been built since the last zoning bylaw update in 2019. Because I do think that this is one of those things where it can feel like it's going to be a really immense change. And I do hope that it sparks some level of new forms of development and different forms of development. But often what I've heard is actually it's just really expensive to still build this form of housing given our land values, even with the changes that we're proposing. And so I think going forward to public engagement, having some sort of contextualized numbers of how many duplexes and triplexes we've seen come forward, given that they have been allowed in our zoning on certain areas, would just help people provide, have a little bit of understanding as to this isn't going to happen overnight. You're not all of a sudden going to have 6 plexes all the way down your street. There's still we're trying to find that balance of yes, enabling this to a certain level, but also I think comforting the community that it's not just going to happen overnight and totally transform the way that our community looks and feels. Yeah, and I don't know how you want to handle the parking component, Chair.
Thank you for that reminder. I'll ask staff, are there any issues, any topics that you would seek further clarity on council's feedback?
Just the parking.
So not sure how to come. I'm not sure that we can come to council can come to a consensus here. I think that perhaps a way to do this would be to move around the table and have each councillor give a short comment on their parking perspective. Mayor Herford?
Yeah, just quickly on this, in other aspects of this, we've sort of acknowledged that it's unlikely to be perfect. FAR, we may need to adjust. I would say that approach can be taken, is sort of implied with all of this. So I know that we want to get it as close to right as we can around the table, but I wonder, what's our opening move here as a group, and that's the piece. It's not that this is the piece that's set in stone going forward. Is that this is the next change, and where do we go inside of that? For me, this middle ground is still quite aggressive, so I'm comfortable with where it is, but I acknowledge the opinions around the table. But So I don't know how we can try to attempt to resolve it here, but I think this is a piece that we're going to continue that we're likely to touch multiple times over the rest of the term. So I'm comfortable with this at this point here. So I would be ready to move the staff, a recommendation around that, but I'm not going to. That's where I am, and yeah, happy to have the group consider that.
Yeah, so before we move to staff recommendation, staff have requested somewhat a little bit more understanding of our perspective of parking. So if there are any further, perhaps I'll invite any further comments on council's perspective on the parking and their thoughts. I welcome them. Councillor Stoner.
Yeah, thank you through the chair. As I mentioned earlier, I think that this is a good middle ground based on what I've heard from around the table. It doesn't go as far as to setting maximums. It still requires a minimum, but only for the primary dwelling units. The proposal is that it will not be applied to accessory dwelling units or secondary suites, which I think is an additional incentive for the type of rental market that we're looking for in our community. And hopefully brings down the cost a little bit. So for me, I think that this is a viable in between. There is still some time, and we will be able to hear from the public a little bit on this. So I don't think we need to make a decision today, but I think what I would be curious to hear if this is like a showstopper for anybody around the table as proposed, if they feel extremely strongly that they wouldn't be able to support this. I think that is the piece of information that staff could probably use going forward.
Any other comments or thoughts on Councillor Greenlaw?
Yeah, I guess one of my questions would be, I suspect that we are going to get a lot of feedback from the public on this specific topic. And I'm wondering how much we're going to be able to incorporate that after the public hearing. So that would be one comment of mine. And as for some of Councillor Hamilton's points about having car-free communities, I love that idea. I think that it would be great to have car-free, like entire pods of apartments and townhouses. But I think this idea of rezoning RS1 lots and then kind of applying that ideology to RS1 lots is going to be problematic. But yeah, I think the reality of our housing situation in Squamish, we have so many houses that have like 6 professionals living in it, sharing these rental units. And that generally comes with 6 cars. So I appreciate that we're trying to cut back on cars and cut back on housing costs by cutting back on parking areas. But the reality is, I think it's going to introduce a lot of problems for our neighborhoods. Thanks.
Councillor French and then Councillor Pettingill.
Thanks, Chair. And I'm generally supportive of what staff has brought forward to us. And car sharing, I think, is a super important direction that we need to be heading towards. The days of a single household owning 4 vehicles can quite nicely be taken care of through car share programs, neighborhood car share programs.
Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, I think what's proposed right now might be a deal breaker for me if we weren't in parallel doing additional parking work. But because, that additional work is ongoing, it's not going to be done in time for this, but we are sort of actively pursuing that. I can sort of live with this for now, I think.
Thanks very much. Yeah, Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. I won't add to what I've already said, other than that I think that we have an event coming up at the end of the month. I think we all need to be sensitive to the insights that our neighborhoods and citizens can provide. I believe we need to preserve the ability to be neighborhood and site specific and adaptive in our parking regulations. We need to recognize the diversity of our neighborhoods, the physical diversity in topographies and road standards. And I don't think that we should assume, as the province does, that there is a direct relationship or the direct relationship assumed between income and car ownership. I'm not sure that that applies to Squamish, where we have our own unique jobs to housing ratio imbalance in this community, with a lot of car dependency, including on people with lower incomes. So let's be Squamish specific. Let's listen. I recall being in the front living room of a home in Garibaldi Estates. They had a lot of observations of what we were looking at through that window on parking patterns on the street. Let's listen to the people in these neighborhoods. Hopefully they'll come out, and we will be taking special care, preserve our ability to be site-specific and adaptive. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Anderson. This is potentially a reason I could see not supporting this change. This is, in my mind, it is extremely important that we start to decouple parking from living. It is extremely important that we allow people the opportunity to purchase property without parking should they want it. By requiring a parking minimum in our bylaw, we are limiting that choice. We are not removing people's choice or ability to purchase property with parking. Builders can still build parking. We are not removing that ability. We are not setting maximums. But I believe it's important that we start allowing people the choice to put parking or not in their property. So it is, and I absolutely recognize that us not moving forward with parking requirements in Squamish over the paid parking over this coming year is going to create additional strain in our community. But I think it's an important direction that our community needs to move in. So it is a potential game showstopper for me. Does staff need any other clarification or feedback?
No, thank you, Chair. That's quite clear.
Thank you very much. Councillor Stoner has moved the staff recommendation, second by Mayor Herford. Do we go through comments or? Yeah. Any further comments? Thank you very much. I will call all those in favor. Thank you. Motion carries unanimously. Any opposed? I think I have to call any opposed. None opposed. Motion carries unanimously. Thanks very much. Now I think we are on recess until 11:45. Thank you very much. All right, thank you very much. Welcome back to the Committee of the Whole meeting for Tuesday, April 9th. The next item on the agenda is the Valleycliffe Daycare Budget Amendment. I'll leave it to staff to introduce themselves and their presentation. Thank you.
Through the chair, thank you. Good morning. Shane Gilbertson, project manager with the Facilities Planning and Construction Department. I'm here with Sarah McJanet from Planning. We'll run you through our presentation on the budget amendment for Valleycliffe Childcare Project, Partnership Project. And I'm going to throw it to Sarah actually to give us our proper pronunciation for the name that we've received from First Nation.
The name of the childcare facility is Munmun Tasmanite. And Munmun is the Squamish word for children. And Tasmanite is the Squamish chief. And so the interpretation is the children in the care of the chief or under the chief.
Thank you, Sarah. So the objective today is to get council endorsement on our updated Class A cost plan that we received from our construction manager. And we need that in order to construction to commence, and also to receive instruction for a capital request in our spring budget amendment for $410,000 to make up a delta in funding. So quick background, right now we're engaged with a construction manager, Clark Builders, on the design, procurement, and construction of the overall facility. The construction manager is chomping at the bit right now, ready to go. They've started a little bit of pre-construction works, but are unable to engage with subcontractors at the moment due to the budget funding. We did receive a Class A budget in January, and that was made up of real world tender prices. So it's reflective of exactly what we're going to pay for the facility, minus any kind of risk that might materialize or opportunities that we realize throughout the construction. We're here now because of initial indicative cost estimate required us to go back to the funder to ask for more funds. And at that same time, an archaeological find on the site introduced some delays to receive proper permitting to continue. Quick project information. So we're in a partnership with School District 48 and for use of their land up at the Valleycliffe Elementary School. So as you can see on the page, we're situated kind of in the back in some a little bit of a park just behind their park area. And the third partner is a Sea to Sky Community Services Society, and they'll be the operator of the facility. It's approximately 2,600 square feet and will provide 36 new daycare spaces, which is broken down into 12 infant and 24 toddler spaces. We did incorporate a modular wall system into the design as a way of minimizing impact to neighbors, as well as speeding up the construction process in the hopes of kind of reducing costs as best we could. Project timing, as I mentioned earlier, construction crews are ready to go. Just awaiting some signatures on subcontracts. Some tree removal has been done on the site and some fencing in place. So it is technically a kind of looks like a construction site at the moment, but nothing permanent has been put in place. We have received our archaeological permit from the province as well as a building permit from the District of Squamish. The large trade packages have been tendered, so concrete, civil, mechanical, electrical, etc. So they're just waiting the signature on their contracts. There are a few others that are outstanding, but they're minimal impact to the overall budget, such as landscaping, I think, is further down the road, so we haven't tendered that one yet. Little breakdown of the project budget. So the current estimate right now, all in, is for $3.3 million, and that is made up of $2.85 million in construction fees. That's the hard costs. We have $256,000 in client costs. So those are costs carried by the district for architect, construction manager, any other consultants that are required. And in our back pocket, we have $200,000 as a client contingency for any risks that materialize. The project budget that's available is $2.89 million. That's from 2.53 from our provincial grant funding and a $360,000 contribution from our CAC reserve that was approved in the fall budget amendment. Right. So the challenges that this project has faced is, well, it's been years since Sarah's been working on it, and the original cost estimate was built in 2021, so just coming out of COVID. So unfortunately, we're still seeing some of the effects of the COVID and unprecedented cost escalations from that. The time extension as a result of the original indicative costing coming in high to get additional funding from the province. At the same time, it was a bit of a perfect storm, and we did uncover the archaeological find on site. And I hate saying that that's a bad thing. It's interesting and very like a good thing that we've uncovered this and following the due process. But it did add about 10 to 14 months of delay to the overall project, which we had our construction manager on board for at the time. So costs were adding and adding as we went. The final, I think, biggest challenge is our FCL requirements in this area. We're in an overland flow zone, so we had to increase the depth of our footings in the foundation. I was on site the other day with our builders and noted that there's some areas where there's going to be 8-foot deep foundation walls for essentially what we're building is a house out there. So it's a difficult build out there. This table is just kind of a rundown of the escalations that we've seen since December 2022 when our original indicative costing came in from our construction manager. As you can see, our Class C costing went up from our original pricing. That took about a year. That was, I think, roughly when we had our first delays. We did a quick round of value engineering to bring that back down, as you can see in our cost plan C indicative Rev 1, to get it down a little bit. That was right before going to tender this last winter, where we came in January at the overall $670 per square foot for the build. Some cost mitigation measures that could be in place. So we have looked at literally every option, I think, possible to get the cost down. And the obviously first one is to reduce the building area. This isn't possible due to our partnerships and BCH requirements and our grant funding requirements. We literally can't make the facility any smaller. We've tightened it up as best we can. We have looked at reducing finish quality as well. But again, I think we're at a spot where we're kind of at the bare minimum, where any less would result in not really a manageable space for the operator or the children using the facility. It also might trigger some issues with VCH approval requirements. As I mentioned earlier, we did go to a modular style wall construction. So we're using TAG Panels, a local supplier, to build the wall panels off site, which is intended to speed up construction process. I think it's about a week they've given us for when they start on site to when they leave and you have a fully enclosed building versus, a couple months of framers on site causing disruptions to the neighbors and just, taking that extra time on site for all the costs to escalate even further. With that, our recommendation is that council endorse the updated cost plan. Class A is detailed in the report dated March 19th, 2024 from the Community Services titled Valleycliffe Daycare Budget Amendment in order for construction to commence, and that staff be instructed to include a capital request in the spring budget amendment for $410,000.
Thank you very much. Questions? Councillor Stoner.
Thanks for the presentation and the details. Appreciate that this has been a challenging location to build. The additional cost escalation is a challenging one for me. I'm not going to lie. We're pushing $90,000 per childcare space at this point. And my mind goes to appreciate that we have committed. We have some sunk costs. I think we'd be better off going and buying the childcare facility that's being built by BOSA and making sure that it's run by a nonprofit operator. So what are our options for something completely alternative here?
Through the chair, thank you for the question. So the alternative would be if we were to cancel the project, we have committed about $300,000 in costs already. So that would be taken out of the budget. I think that would also trigger a re-review with the grant funder for that cash, given that they've already approved this approach. And I agree the cost escalations are difficult. Just, I guess, going back to note that the original plan going through the class budgets, we started off on the wrong trajectory coming straight out of COVID. So it's difficult to go back in time, obviously, but knowing where we are now, we obviously would have came in at a higher price right off the bat and hopefully never would have been in this situation. We've been effectively chasing our tail the whole time since our first cost estimate and our grant approval.
I appreciate that to some degree. However, even the change from the Class C budget in 2023 to 2024. So the Class C budget had an estimate of a 10% accuracy, and here we are 20% over that Class C budget. And appreciate that we're still feeling some of the effects of COVID, in particular concrete. But that seems unreasonable where we had an estimate with a accuracy number of plus or minus 10%, and here we are 20% over that.
Yeah, through the chair. Don't exactly have an answer for you on that. That is real world pricing that we're seeing in the Squamish market for construction. So as best as our construction manager can estimate, it still is beholden to whatever comes in from tenders.
Sorry, Councillor French.
Thanks, Chair. I too am struggling with these cost increases, and highlighted by one item that just jumped out at me. It includes $15,750 for the site superintendent vehicle. Really? Like, we're paying for somebody's vehicle on this already significantly expensive project? Is this standard practice?
Through the chair, thank you for pointing that out. And that is one item that we have pushed back on our construction manager for, given that we're hoping to find local superintendents. That's a major challenge that we've noticed with all projects in the district, is finding good local trades to work here. So most people are coming up from the city. That being said, this particular project, they have looked into finding accommodation for their superintendent, so that cost might not materialize entirely. But absolutely, we're picking apart items like that and pushing back to see where we can find savings as well.
Okay, great. Glad to hear that. And that's my only question at this point, Chair.
Thanks very much. Mayor Herford.
Thank you for your work on this. It's extremely challenging for us to interact with it on on this one, at the touch points that we have. And I know this is where you've been spending a lot of time. I'm curious about, I understand the complexity that this site comes with, and I think we all understand it a lot more now than we did when we set off on this journey. And similar to Councillor Stoner's line of questioning around pivoting to something else, like how tied to this site are we? I get that we have sunken costs, but I'm really struggling with this one. I don't want to lose the funding from the province, but I look at this when I look at a partnership with the province funding, arguably the province coming with some land through the school board, and then all the risk seems to be on us around this table and on the taxpayers Squamish. So I wonder how and whether that's through taxation or CAC, whatever the funding mechanism is, right? So is this application tied to this site, like, and we lose the provincial portions if all signs start pointing to needing to pursue something else, and have a greater which will likely come with a greater return on investment as far as the number of spaces and so on, even when factored in some loss of sunk costs potentially?
Thank you for the question. Through to the chair. For background, certainly with the funding agreement with the province, the funding is tied to this site, the number of spaces, and the design as presented. So as part of the application that we originally made in 2019 for the first round of the capital funding, we presented the proposal, the project design, the capacity, and this site. So any changes to that do trigger fulsome review with the province under the funding agreement. For added context, when we began to engage with the school district through the childcare action planning, we did do a fairly in-depth review across all school sites within the community to look at what school sites had opportunity for additional space, either within the school or outside the school. There is at a number of the other school sites, there are a number of additional facilities for after school care, as well as spaces inside the school. And then we also had to, the school district contemplated where they are seeing growth at school sites and had their own review of expansion plans as well, so that they were really clear as a partner that they would look for opportunities to co-locate where where additional space creation was still respectful of their plans for school expansion. So Valleycliffe Elementary rose to the top as the preferred site at that time. We were also in tandem looking at all of our municipal lands as well for opportunity for locating a facility either within a renovation or as a standalone facility. Obviously, affordable housing is also a top priority. So there are multiple needs, but because the school district presented opportunity for expansion and inclusion of space at Valleycliffe, it rose to the top as a shared, mutually supported site. So we had brought that to council, the council of the day back to share those recommendations. I hope that answers the question. I feel like there's maybe another component.
No, thank you. That's helpful. And this is understanding how we got here is a helpful piece of dealing with where we are. I suppose the other piece of that is the risk borne by the other partners in this? Or is the risk exclusively and the ask? There's no similar ask coming to any other order of government or partner in this equation. Is that correct?
Through the chair, I'm not sure if you're asking about is there an opportunity to leverage more funding at this point. When we went back through the cost escalation process with the province in December 2022 through March, we submitted a reapplication with updated costing. The province came back, provided additional funding to the tune of the 2.53 million, but we're clear that they were not going to be supplying additional funding on top of that. This is in terms of going after additional funding at this point in time and trying to stack it. Our understanding is we're not able to do that. We have been looking at additional funding for kind of peripheral pieces for landscaping and things like that through Tree Canada as an example. But that's not the lion's share to address the larger delta. If it makes, I'm not sure if it makes council feel any better, but certainly across the province for other projects, they are also, that were approved at the same time our project was, they are also experiencing the same kinds of cost escalations and challenges with their original budget estimates. Certainly we've been sort of watching that occur as well. And I think it's very challenging time, but in terms of pivoting at this point, it would present a lot of challenges. There's basically many years of partnership work that has occurred with the school district and with City Sky Community Services. The school district is, the ground lease is complete, and with City Sky Community Services, they are working around their operational planning as well. So definitely the partnership has taken a while to pursue and complete. So we're in a good place there. And at the end of the day, we're hopeful that we can continue on this project to deliver urgently needed spaces.
Councillor Pettingill?
Yeah, just picking up, and on my colleague's question, and I don't want to, because I'm not an expert in this area, but there are a few things in the budget which just seem odd to me, and then sort of shake my confidence in the overall budget. And I see in total about $7,000 for snow removal. And if we're talking about prefabricated framing and so on, I'm wondering why that amount. And there's small tools and office equipment, which is things I would expect a contractor to have. And so while individually the amounts aren't massive compared to the whole thing, it just sort of makes me wonder, like, are we buying all new stuff and are contingencies too big? Or I'm just wondering if you can speak to, because you did mention there's some things we're pushing back on. Are there a number of things we're pushing back on here, or?
Through the chair, thanks for the question. For items like snow clearing, typically we'll go to like a cash allowance with that with the contractor, where if we need it, we dip into it. That's not typically just for on the construction site itself. It would be maybe for access for trades and stuff as well. Take the burden off our public works team if we're making their snow removal any more difficult. But absolutely, we can push back with that and work with them on that to have savings. Small tools is typical for contractors to purchase new for a project. Those usually get handed over to the district at the end of the project as well. So we do own that and can put that into our kind of maintenance fleet or our public works team. As far as other pushbacks, again, we're kind of scrutinizing every amount in that cost plan. One thing that I didn't include in this presentation was the opportunities that are available, which are I've noted in the report as they're currently risks, so I can't necessarily count on them. The biggest one is our BC Hydro costs. And I'm kind of steering your question a little bit away, but it is a massive amount where right now we're assuming the hydro feed is coming off of Westway, so it's a long underground run. Whereas the design may end up coming from Hemlock Avenue, which is much closer, and reduce that cost significantly. So items like that, like I said, we can't account for them just yet because they're not confirmed, but there are some savings in those regards where it could bring that cost down. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think I just, sort of want some comfort about, is this a reasonable budget? It's, seemed like there's some things that maybe the contractor was pushing the limits on some things, but I'm not an expert in this. So, okay. Appreciate the feedback. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Councillor Greenlaw.
Thanks, through the chair. Thanks for bringing this information forward. As you know, this council feels very strongly about promoting childcare options, so it's a particularly difficult conversation for me. I too am increasingly uncomfortable with these budgetary escalations and the legacy of consistent underestimates of cost. I have a hard time with this budgetary ask in particular because it only includes a 5% contingency, which historically has been indicated that it will be an underestimate. But I did have a couple items that I wanted to seek clarification on. One of them was that hydro, that $105,000 hookup cost. And I was wondering, I know that staff has explored increasing the amount of funding coming from the province, but I was wondering if they'd explored perhaps petitioning the province to give us support in kind effectively and like waive, for instance, a BC Hydro hookup fee if there was any potential for that.
Through the chair, the first part of your question about the contingency, yes, the 5% overall is a little shy. I will say that right now. That being said, as I mentioned, the further cost savings that we are pushing at including into the budget would effectively beef up that contingency. Also, this one is based off of tender packages that are ready to be signed. It's not just a construction estimate, so those are more of a guaranteed cost. As far as cost in kind, no, we haven't examined that, partially because, especially with BC Hydro, use that as an example. This one, it was an estimate based early on from conversations with Hydro about where the service would need to come from. When they get into the nuts and bolts of the design, it's, well, I don't want to say likely. I'm really hoping that we come from the other end and end up having a significantly lower installation cost. But as far as other opportunities, no, to answer your question, no, haven't looked at any of those at the moment.
Sorry, Councillor Greenlaw, you were muted.
Yeah, just give me 1 second. Sorry, I'm trying to juggle multiple apps here. Another thing I had a question about was There's a significant discrepancy between the cost of like $11,000 per square meter, for instance, for this project versus what you frequently hear for housing projects and what was presented in your Canadian cost guide of $4,300 per square meter. And I was wondering if staff could speak to that discrepancy, as childcare is not presented explicitly in that guide.
Yeah, through the chair, that's exactly it. It's not presented explicitly. There's also, and myself and others have called it the Squamish factor, where it's really difficult to compare apples to apples with the Canadian cost guide, as our closest neighbor, North Van, is the pricing that we would compare to. Just on another note for that, they are building a separate childcare facility right now, and again, impossible to do an apples to apples comparison because they're including other facilities within that build, but they're looking at about, if you use that number, about $135,000 per space, whereas we're around 80 to 90. But again, there's no apples to apples comparison out there at the moment for this, so it's really difficult to make that.
Okay, thank you.
Is that it, Councillor Greenlaw?
Yeah, that's all I have for now. Thanks.
Thank you. If there's no further questions around the table, I'll do one round and then I'll come around for another second round of questions. So I have some questions around timing of things. When was the archaeological find?
The archaeological work happened in May. That field study happened. So there was an initial archaeological impact assessment, and then we had to apply for an archaeological site alteration permit, and that was issued. There was a very lengthy delay in acquiring that site alteration permit, and that was acquired in September, I believe, the actual permit to do works.
So that was May 2023. Some 3 or 4 months before the last Class C estimate.
I'm going to have to check that. Apologies, just one moment.
So the core of the question is, was the archaeological find known at the time of the first revised Class C estimate?
To the chair, the construction manager was aware of it, yes. And so it wasn't known though when we went back to the province for funding.
Thanks. Did the FCL change at any point in time during this project?
Through the chair, no, it didn't. But early on estimates are using kind of high level looks at the design. And once those are kind of completed and fully fleshed out, then details emerge where the wall height is kind of verified, which is where the extra costs come from.
And were there any sort of fundamental changes to our design that would have created a significant change in either the electrical or the mechanical design and trade requirements then?
Through the chair, a little more clarification from what time to the time period there.
Thank you very much. Between September 2023, between the time of the last Class C revised estimate and this new Class A estimate, were there any significant changes to the design?
Through the chair, no, nothing significant that would trigger an additional new cost. Again, it's just assumptions that the construction manager would make with their previous projects versus what we're seeing locally for costing.
Through our procurement processes, and this may be going sort of down a road that you may not have expertise in, right? So I fully accept and I don't know is perfectly acceptable. In our procurement processes, do we look at all at the construction manager or the builder's track record of cost escalation through a project?
Through the chair, no. That's a good question that we could use as scoring on next rounds. We do look at their previous experience and related experience and types of projects, but not necessarily their kind of track record, like you mentioned.
And now I have a question about what the meaning of the accuracy number on a cost estimate is. I interpret that to mean, so if we take the Class C estimate, would you mind bringing up the table of estimates? So that September 25th, 2023 estimate, Class 3, I interpret that to mean the construction management company, our building partner, has estimated the total construction cost to be 2.26 million with an uncertainty of 10%. So that would mean they're confident, in my understanding, they're confident that that should come in under 2.49 million with all of the information that we've given them. Is that correct?
Yeah, through the chair, the accuracy percentage also relates to level of detail available. So at that time, they might not have a full kind of IFC type set of drawings from the consultants. So they're having to make some assumptions there as well, which is, again, giving themselves a buffer area there.
So that buffer is meant to account for the uncertainty because they don't have full designs. Is that correct?
Through chair, yeah, for uncertainty on items that are remain to be designed, as well as discrepancies between their kind of pricing data and what they'll receive from the market.
And now I think I may be bridging into comments here, so I will stop myself from bridging into comments and ask if there are any more questions. Councillor Pettingill?
Yeah, sorry, and you may have spoken to this briefly, but I'm just wondering, can you clarify, is there something fundamentally challenging about the site aside, setting aside the archaeological find? My understanding is many sites are challenging, and so is this, I guess what I'm trying to understand, is there something unique about this location that is driving a significant portion of the escalations? Or is it really just the COVID, inflation, all this other stuff, and we would see this sort of no matter where we were trying to build?
Yeah, through the chair, like you mentioned, the overall COVID and the lengthy delays is just what was adding the bulk of the escalation cost. The topography of the site is slightly challenging. It does slope from kind of north to south, which is also increasing the overall footing depth, adding to the concrete cost, which we also saw a large escalation in cost just on that single line item as well in the last year.
Councillor Stoner?
Thank you, through the chair. Appreciate the timing probably won't work out here in terms of trying to find stackable grants, but the federal government did just recently announce the childcare loan program with $1 billion in low interest loans and $60 million for non-repayable grants for childcare expansion and renovations. Is that something that we can look into?
Through the chair, we can definitely look into that. I am not aware if we are and can't confirm if we're eligible for the loan program. Certainly, we'd have to look at sort of financing scenarios, I think, in terms of different approaches if we were to pursue something like that compared to what's proposed here is to utilize CAC reserve at this time. I see Ms. Buxford has her hand up.
Thank you, through the chair. One consideration that needs to be brought forward in terms of any type of loan is that it does have to go through the AAP process, even if it's through the provincial government. So from a timing perspective, that is a consideration that we'll need to bring on board.
Thank you very much. Councillor French?
Thanks, Chair. Councillor Pettingill's pointing out of the small tools and the office equipment. have me just wondering if we could get a bit of a definition of what constitutes small tools and what constitutes office equipment in this context, mainly for future learning on things like these.
Yeah, through the chair. Small tools, we typically have a threshold for value. I think it's usually $500. Anything under that is considered a small tool. Office equipment, a little less clear on that, but I think it would be printer paper, stuff like that. Anything needed at the site office to operate.
Any further questions on the second round? So I'm going to ask one more question on the second round. I see our construction partners have a responsibility of providing us with estimates and uncertainties on those estimates. We have a responsibility of choosing to either fund or not fund a project based on those estimates and the uncertainties on those estimates. If we were to approve, so when I look at the September 2025, the September cost estimate, and I see no major changes from our end on the project from September to January, I ask myself, how much responsibility does the construction partner need to bear to be within their own projected budget? And so what would be the consequence of us approving a 10% additional on the construction cost as of September 25th, which would mean an additional $230,000 as opposed to an extra $410,000? What would be the consequence of that council decision?
Through the chair, again, good question. I think this goes back to the model that we're using, which I think we're tending to stray away from in recent projects. And it's absolutely right. They don't necessarily have a lot of skin in the game when it comes to that. They present the numbers that are based on their historical data. The trouble is, like I mentioned before, when you go to tender, you get what you get. And if it comes in high, it comes in high. So if we were to accept that indicative Rev 1 budget with a 10% contingency, we'd still be here today asking for the delta. Does that answer your question?
No, I don't. I think if we today approved $230,000 additional funding from CACs instead of $410,000 from CACs, because that is what the construction company projected as their maximum increase, what would be the fallout of that decision?
Through the chair. Hi, Cal Bragg. Hi, Mayor and Council. A good answer to that one would be we're not actually in contract with the builder just yet. If we're in contract with the builder, the risk would be onto them because they've said to us, this is what the numbers are, this is what the budgets are, this is what we're going to build to. Right now, where the second part of today was requesting us to move into that stage, which is Class A, and that's where, I wouldn't say guaranteed, but we've got a fixed price to build moving forward. If we come into a stage now where costs start to blow out, it's on the builder's head. For now, we're still working through that process. So if we start to reduce the budgets now, we've worked this project down so much that there's not really much else we can do from the actual project side. There's no more money to pull out other than the contingencies as we work through the process. On the other side, from the funding side, I think that's what we can probably start looking at. I think that's where your question's starting to veer to as well. Is that correct? Or is it from the actual pulling money out of the project and saying you need to build it for 8% less? We've worked this project so much that we feel that there's not an allowance there at all. It's very skinny.
And if this project were to be open, so we don't have contracts with this construction partner. And if we were to put out and say we have $2.5 million to build this facility, do you have a sense of whether we would find a contractor to build that facility for $2.5 million?
Through the chair, we can do that and go back to tender. The problem there is there's a very good chance that it's going to come back and say it's going to be $3.5 million. We've gone through the process with the project team right now. The project team have the most amount of information on this project. They understand what our ramifications are from the budgets. If we went to put it back out to market, the chances of it going higher than where we're currently sitting, and again, this is just a professional estimate, it's a very big risk that we'll be going into territory beyond the numbers that we're talking right now.
Through the chair, just to add to that, as far as going through the design and costing with the team earlier, just to give you an idea of what we did, we looked at every single item down to removing mirrors in the bathroom to reduce cost. So just to get that across, that we've literally looked at every possible avenue to reduce cost, and like Cal mentioned, if we do delay that, we take a significant risk in this coming in actually higher than what's included in our cost plan A.
All right. Any further questions, Councillor Pettingill?
Yeah.
Sorry, Councillor Pettingill. We'll go quick questions and then we'll look for a motion.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just sort of trying to look forward because I think part of there's a struggle with this, but then is like, oh, so is this what it means for all daycares that someone wants to build in the community going forward? But the other piece you mentioned, we're not following this model more. I think you're alluding to IPD, which we've been using. Does IPD generally, is it workable on a project of this scale, or I had sort of understood it was only larger scale?
Yeah, through the chair, that's my understanding as well. Not to say that it couldn't work for this scale, but it is ideal for, was it over 15? Yeah, they typically go for over 15 million. But that being said, we could take some of the principles from those IPD projects and try and insert them into the new processes going forward for other builds as well.
Thank you, Councillor Pettingill. No further questions. Mayor Herford?
I'll move the staff recommendation and I'll speak to it if it's seconded.
Councillor French, seconds.
Thank you. When I think back in the history of this project, which started last term, there's such optimism based on the work of our partners to provide air quotes free land to construct this facility on. We've worked the province to up to 2.53 million in funding, and this one, I as much as I'm disappointed to see the cost escalation and being caught sort of in a bit of what I'm viewing as a perfect storm of timing and site specific issues, being the flood control piece and the archaeological find, those types of things. It's incredibly challenging. However, I don't see walking away from the $2.53 million from the province as a viable option. So for me, it's supporting this to get this project over the line, or not just walking away from the $2.53 million from the province, but the hundreds of thousands, was it 300,000 or something we had in sunk costs, which just isn't palatable to me. So I'm not particularly excited about supporting this, but we know that there's a dire need for childcare in our community. So I think that pushing forward on this is appropriate, but we need to learn the lessons. If there's a lesson in here, whatever those are, I don't know what those are exactly at this point until we can really do until this thing is up and running, and we can really step back from it and think about, see if there were things that could be learned that we could apply to future processes on whichever initiative we undertake. But given the need for childcare and the funding on the table from partners, I think that I don't really see much of another choice from moving forward. I do have faith in staff, that staff with this budget approval, if it's successful in hand, will continue to find those efficiencies where appropriate. The hydro one is particularly interesting, is that's a big piece. So I'm reluctantly supporting this moving forward. And yeah, and thank you for all your work on it and for coming in here with not the best news, but with great information, and so we can tackle this together. Thank you.
Councillor French.
Thanks, Chair. I too am not excited about supporting this and am feeling a little bit like we have to. We have little to no choice. We do have choice, but it's limited. One of the things that has me increasing my small level of comfort with supporting this is the fact that it's happening all over BC. These cost escalations are not unique to Squamish, not unique to this project, and that's a sad reflection of what's happening all across BC. This project has also created some cynicism in me around the whole notion of free land. This project was supposed to be cost effective because it was going onto free land. I'll leave it at that. So in supporting this motion, I encourage staff, wherever it's possible, to push back on costs, to do so and be aggressive in it.
Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a little bit torn here. I'm going to have to listen to the rest of my colleagues. And I think I'm having an almost contrary perspective in the last few minutes, just that if this is in fact the reality of building daycare, and it is what it is, I do wonder about, and while I generally agree with the idea of pushing back on costs, I do wonder about the incremental cost of making it a little bigger. It sounds like one of the cost savings we've looked for is making it as small as possible, but I would assume the incremental cost of providing a few more spaces, that may be the more cost-effective option rather than try to build more spaces in another location and all of this. And so I wonder if that is the one area where we don't want to scrimp, and given the context of everything, if there's actually a rationale to put a little bit more in to make sure we're maximizing the space we get out of this investment, because I think it's going to be very hard and we're going to feel, once bitten, twice shy before making another such investment. And so are we maximizing at least the space of this one? Anyways, I'll leave that there for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Pettingill. Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. First, before I forget, I think that the name referred to by Ms. McJanet earlier is a really nice touch. I really applaud this, the collective effort to come up with that. I assume it refers to the Kalalit legend in the rock wall face above the site. Secondly, I have to note the use of the phrasing modular wall system, quote unquote, and modular style wall construction. Internationally, you distinguish between modular as being 3D volume units and panelized construction, flat pack, if you like. So I find it a little bit confusing. Tag Panels has competitors here in Squamish that do specialize in modular volume units, but it's just a little, for us, I think we all need to be educated about prefabrication systems, offsite systems. So it's just a note there, the terminology I find confusing. The cost savings log has been provided to us. I'm satisfied there's been some very diligent and thorough work done in this. An item that is curious for me concerns the fill, that the backfill to slab elevation with excavated material. And there's this $20,000 potential cost savings here. It occurs to me that we have a lot of trucking of low-grade fill to Squamish being dumped here. A lot. Yesterday, I came across 3 trucks, the truck and trailer. I mean, it's happening all the time. I just wonder whether there's opportunities there that we don't know about or not checking in on. A small item, just curious, because there's an abundant amount of low-grade fill being brought and dumped at Squamish at a couple of different sites. Thirdly, delay is our enemy. We've seen delays relating to the site and its physical attributes and the consequences of where we've ended up. I think we need to learn some lessons here. about building on the floodplain. This is the Squamish floodplain. On the Squamish Valley floodplain, we've had the Adventure Center experience, 2004, 2005. We've got our public works building site challenges. In the private sector, the 7 peaks and 3 summits, all related to the same issue, building on the floodplain. And the costs and unexpected and learning that we need to take into account always in our environment. The other delay, archaeological site. It seems to me that I'm going to be bold here. We need to be strategic, and we are working our way towards an overview, our archaeological overview assessment for the valley. This is part of the heritage management strategy that we approved just recently. Overdue, badly needed. This is not a habitation site, I would venture. Meanwhile, we are building on habitation sites without attention to archaeological impact assessments. Spirit Creek, Harborview Place, Scott Crescent, back of the north site, Wilson Crescent. So we have to face reality about let's catch up and do those archaeological overview assessments so that we can together with the Squamish Nation identify priorities, because we will find archaeological finds anywhere and everywhere, but we need to be strategic and really focus on our habitation sites. I'm concerned that we're not doing that. Finally, well, I guess I'll just wrap up there. I'm wholeheartedly support the earlier comments of Mayor Herford. I think we must forge ahead, delay is our enemy, and learn our lessons here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Stoner.
Thank you, through the chair. I won't be supporting on the motion on the floor, and it does pain me knowing how critical the childcare crisis is in our community. Every spot really does matter. But at some point, I think you also really need to reflect where we are and potentially cut our losses. I appreciate the amount of effort that has gone into us, the number of partners that have come to the table to find the solutions. I think we've turned every stone over on this particular site. And still the cost is coming in at over $90,000 per space. Our childcare action plan identifies that if we want to reach our 30% target, we need 535 new childcare spaces by 2024. If we're doing that at this current cost, it's $48 million. This is not a viable way to build our way out of the childcare crisis. I would rather take our CAC money and go back to the province and hope for the best and try and buy something that is already built and secure it for a nonprofit provider. I think that makes more sense. I've spoken to a number of folks who are building privately, and granted, the end childcare costs are not guaranteed to be as low as Sea to Sky Community Services is providing, but they're coming in at $20,000 to $40,000 per space, not $90,000 per space. And so I think just where we are, again, it's not a criticism of how we got here. I think it's a reality of just the project, the space, some of the delays. But for me, at the end of the day, it's both Squamish taxpayer money, it's BC provincial taxpayer money, and it doesn't make sense for me to spend $3.3 million on 36 spaces. And I think the further down we go, there's still a level of uncertainty that I don't feel comfortable with. I think it's plus minus 5%, but we've seen that come in over and over again. And so I think that there's still a risk that this comes back yet again with another cost escalation. And then I'd feel really uncomfortable that we kept going down this path. And so I'm challenged by the decision, for sure. It's not an easy one. I think there's obviously sunken costs that will bear on our budget, but I think it's a good reminder of sometimes we choose to extend into things that are beyond our scope in an effort to try and solve other level of government's challenges. And this really does need to get put back on the province and the federal government, not on us.
Thanks very much, Councillor Pettit. Councillor Greenlaw.
Thanks through the chair. Thanks to staff for bringing forward this information to support this very difficult conversation. I'm going to speak in an uneasy opposition of this motion. echoing the comments made by Councillor Stoner, I appreciate that we have more solid numbers, given that this is a Class A budgeting. But my experience sitting in this chair is that we rarely go under budget on these projects. And historically, specifically on this project, we have consistently surpassed the appropriate upper contingency limit on each budgetary class estimate for this project. So to my mind, what we are effectively approving here by continuing on this trajectory is actually a budgetary increase of maybe $600,000. This is not the first time that we as a district have found ourselves in a bit of a juggernaut situation where it's realistically too late to consider other options without significant impact. And I must admit, it makes me very uncomfortable. It's especially disheartening when you consider that this cost is effectively the bare bones for this facility. And when I hear about our childcare facilities having basically every amenity that can be stripped from it, it makes me wonder about the quality of the facility that will come out of this. And I appreciate the staff has worked really hard on this. I appreciate that everybody has put in a significant amount of effort. But I too have a very serious discomfort about the economics of this conversation. Another comment about cost escalations, I do hear a lot of it attributed to basically ripple effects from COVID, but I do increasingly wonder if this is the new normal for construction costs as living costs have escalated and so have resource costs. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I will not be speaking in support of this motion. I think that we have a responsibility to work with our partners, with our construction partners, to, when we say that we will provide funding, that we follow through on providing that funding. Our construction partners have a responsibility to give us estimates with reasonable contingencies, with reasonable estimates, so that we don't get carried down a path one step at a time, cost increase, cost increase, cost increase, cost increase. I don't know of another way to signal to our building community that they need to do a better job of estimating these things. The impacts of COVID have been well known since September 2023. The impacts of the archaeological assessment, that was known before September 2023. The rough site designs, those were known before September 2023. I don't see a reason why our construction partner, a well-respected professional corporate company, cannot give us a cost estimate that is within their own uncertainty. And so with that, I will be speaking out. Sorry, that's the end of my comment. I will not be supporting this motion. Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, I know I said I hadn't made up my mind. I'm still struggling. I will say if this fails, I would actually like to see if it's possible an understanding after the fact of, is there a way to pull down the per space cost by actually increasing some funding? I would be interested in that. And one of the things I'm also grappling is I agree with everything that's been said. I also look at how much we put into pickleball and some other things. And I'm trying to measure the need versus the investments we're making and really struggling with that.
All right. With that, I will call the question. All in favor? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Didn't see that. Councillor Greenlaw, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I was just wondering, to Councillor Pettengill's comments, is there any way if we can see the feasibility of putting this provincial grant to something else before we, make this final decision?
I think that's a question to staff, which is much larger than they can likely answer right now. And we believe, if my understanding of procedure is we have a motion on the floor and we need to respond to that motion on the floor. Is that?
Through the chair, if I may, I did hear staff say that our current grant agreement is tied specifically to the site with the number of childcare or the childcare spaces. So I think that option, from what I've heard from staff's comments in earlier part of this conversation, is that's not really an option.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Thank you. With that, I will call the question. All those in favor of the staff recommendation and all opposed? Councillor Pettingill, Hamilton, and Stoner opposed. Motion fails. Councillor Stoner?
I will move. There's an alternative to the staff recommendation in our staff report. And I'll move a variation of it that council directs staff to go back out to RFP and tender of this project to see if it can come in within the existing project budget, and otherwise stop the project and the grant would be refused.
Seconder for the motion? Clarification for the motion.
I had a question I wanted to ask first before it was moved, if that's.
Councillor Greenlaw, are you seconding?
Yes, I was.
Okay. So, sorry, procedurally, I think we're.
But I'm happy to wait for clarification too. I'm happy to rescind my seconding for clarification.
Okay, so seconding rescinded, which gives an opportunity for Councillor Pettingill to seek clarification.
Well, it wasn't a clarification on the motion, so I don't think it's valid at this point. It was something to clarify before we got to a motion.
I'll withdraw my motion.
Thank you, Councillor Stoner. Councillor Pettingill.
So and just as back to my comment, I understand that moving the location and so on is not feasible from a grant. But to my mind, it's not clear that looking at additional space and whether you count it as new spaces or just something that might turn into new spaces in the future, if we make the facility a little bit bigger, can we effectively take the cost down? That is something for me that would be helpful. This upcoming motion may negate that, and so it's not an issue, but I would presume that is something we could look at and maybe do within the current site if we decided we wanted to. But again, maybe that's moot at this point.
Councillor Stoner.
I think that's a question through to staff as to whether we can actually put more spaces on this site.
For the chair, yeah, there's space available. It would need a redesign and further costs incurred to do that, but yeah, absolutely.
Mayor Herford.
Thank you. On the provincial funding piece, it's tied to the site in this project. So my understanding, so I'm assuming that if we find ways to put more spots on the site, the provincial number isn't going to move. Is that correct? Okay, I'm seeing confirmation from staff.
That's correct. The funding is set at the 2.53.
So
provided.
Seeing as the last motion with the funding failed, I think whatever we do going forward, we understand, we make sure that we articulate why that failed, whether it's a larger funding ask is appropriate, given that it brings the cost per space down. If that's how council would like to score this piece versus the raw dollar amount, because the raw dollar amount is going to go up if we consider that piece. And that's something that is a reality of the conversation. So I just want to make sure that we're clear on these, on what's likely to move and the future discussion that will be required if that transpires.
Thanks, Mayor Herford. Councillor Stoner. Did you? Yep. Thank you. Giving Councillor Stoner a moment.
Thank you through the chair and to my council colleagues, because that gave me a minute to reflect on what it was that I was putting forward. And so I'm going to propose something slightly alternative to what I had previously, and that is a three-part motion. One, that staff be instructed to include a request in the spring budget amendment for $230,000 instead of $410,000. And I will email this to you, Victoria. That staff go back out to RFP tender for the Valleycliffe Daycare within the proposed updated budget. And further, that if that RFP tender is not successful, then staff be directed to stop the project and refuse the grant. That seconded, I'll speak to it.
I'll second that.
So I think that this is a bit of a long shot, and appreciate that it doesn't go all the way. I am still relatively uncomfortable with the cost escalation. This caps it to the accuracy of 10% above the Class C estimate with our current cost escalations. It gives staff a chance to go back one more time to try and bring this project to fruition. I appreciate that that might not be successful, and I think at that point we cut our losses. I think it's a happy medium to where we are. It's not perfect. It's still far above the per space amount that I would like to spend, but also I think recognizes the amount of time and effort that has gone into creating this. I hear my council colleagues' questions in terms of wanting to put more spaces on this site. To me, I think instead of doing that, or in addition to doing that, we cut our losses on this particular project and go back to the drawing board on where else could we put childcare, whether we're purchasing that from existing developers and we're not building it ourselves, whether we add more spaces, there's more funding that is coming down from the federal government through the province, and we reapply, I think, is the approach with a more accurate and revised number, so that this doesn't continue to cost escalate on the District of Squamish taxpayers.
Thanks very much. Mayor Herford.
Thank you. Given that the last motion failed, I'll support this one as it has some glimmer of hope of keeping the project alive. So in the spirit of leaving no stone unturned, I'll support this direction, and I hope that it gets this across the line. This is an area where there is funding from other orders of government, but there's also responsibility to other orders of government. And when we're through this project, I think there's a bigger discussion about how we realize childcare spaces in our community, because the need is ever growing. So so thank you to my colleague for bringing forward something that keeps this some hope alive on this, but we'll see what comes of it. So I'll be supporting.
Councillor Anderson.
I'll be supporting the present motion reluctantly for the reason I highlighted earlier. Delay is a real enemy for us, and so I'm concerned about that being a continuing factor in the process we're now proposing. I'd also would like to emphasize the point made earlier by Councillor Stoner. I don't think we can underemphasize it. And what is our role in childcare? And I think that this is a large issue that we should continue to be actively concerned about in concert with other municipalities. This is pure and simply offloading. We do not have responsibility for childcare. That wasn't the intention. We do have a superb planning document that we approved a couple of years ago. We're trying our best to identify opportunities. We're trying to be opportunistic, but we need to maintain that advocacy posture vis-a-vis senior government regarding responsibility for childcare.
Councillor French.
Thanks, Chair. Not excited about supporting this motion either, but I will be. The fiscal conservative inside of me is well in favor of taking this direction. and my zero accuracy crystal ball is telling me that this motion is likely killing this project, which we need daycare spaces. There's no doubt about that. But if we are going to kill this project, we are going to send and have started into the process of sending a bold message to the provincial government that we've reached a level of offloading that we're simply not prepared to accept.
Councillor Greenlaw.
Thanks. I will reluctantly support this motion. My concern is that this motion, that this will just serve to be a drain on staff resources and ultimately to no avail. But again, in the spirit of turning every stone, I will support it. And also because I know firsthand how difficult it is to not have access to childcare. And I do feel like I get that it's a downloading, don't get me wrong, but I also know that women in particular need this resource. And yeah, so I will support this motion. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much. I'll also be supporting this motion, absolutely recognizing the importance of childcare, but also understanding and recognizing the importance of our fiduciary duty to ensure that our construction partners, when they provide us estimates, provide realistic estimates. Delays in this project have been created by unrealistic estimates. And so I believe there is onus on the partners, on our construction partners, to provide more realistic estimates, even if they're high. We need to see those high estimates first. With that, I will call the question. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. We're a little bit behind time now, so we now move on to the Q1 Real Estate Facilities and Master Plan. Speaking of construction. All right, we're just waiting for staff to get their reports up. Oh, there we go. Or their presentation up. Thanks very much. We'll now turn it over to staff for the Q1 Real Estate and Facilities Master Plan project update.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. My name is Cal Bragg. I'm the Director of Facilities Planning and Construction at the District. Thank you for your time this afternoon. This is a memo to Council. It is an update for the first quarter of this year, so coming into the end of March. of facilities and construction throughout the district. This is not just the real estate facilities master plan. There's a few other projects that we're working on as well. So the projects we're focused on is Fire Hall number 2 on Tantalus Road, the Public Works facility. There's a lot of projects going on under Brennan Park there. We've got 2 grants and we've got some staged work in there. Also in the grounds, we've got a splash park and playground. Covered structures in downtown here, Squamish Adventure Centre, interior update, and also the Junction Park washrooms. Fire Hall number 2, overall, we're running on time, on budget. We're about 85% complete. We're coming up to completion in the end of Q2 here, which is we're looking at the end of May for an occupancy date. Budget's $15.8 million. I'm sure we've all driven past it and seen the construction going on. The facade's going on now. We've seen the actual finishes are starting. We're getting a really good look and feel of the fire hall. The drywall's going on inside and paint is going on as well, and millwork, which is all at the very tail end of the project here. So landscaping's on the critical path, as well as plumbing, HVAC, and all the electrical fit out. So the next steps is to install the bay doors. They're a little bit late, but it's not affecting the overall timeline here. Finishing off the facade, finishing off the landscaping, and powering through to the occupancy date here in the end of May. We've had a few little issues and material delays, but again, it hasn't overall affected the final occupancy date here. The Public Works facility, we have moved the initial timing for that one originally, but we're on time on the new scheduling here. We're looking for a completion date at the end of next year, and this is to be confirmed. We're working through the detailed timing here. The current work, there's a little bit of jargon in here. I had to squish a lot of information in, so I'll open it a little bit. We're working on the preload, which is the major soil fill on site now to get the bearing pressure for the soil so we can build on top of it. We're working through the flood control or the flood construction level works here as we're raising all of the site by 3 meters, give or take. We've had some minor soil contamination management, which is expected on this site. We're working on the environmental sensitive areas on the north there. The building design is about 60%, and we're running on the yard design about 60% as well. The staff also working on accessibility, the level of sustainability for the project, and then also the allowance for future expansion. The next steps is to continue the existing earthworks. We're pushing hard now for a building permit set to be handed in about 4 to 6 weeks here. We're going to get an update for a Class C budget, and it's more of a checkpoint, and we're working towards that. And then we'll be coming back to council for Class A endorsement, and that's when we lock the final price in for the project. The hurdles, as we've known, there's a lot of working through the flood construction level. There's a lot of, we'll say, hidden mushrooms that we've had to work through with utilities on site. And I think we've uncovered the majority of them. And again, it's still on time, on budget so far. So the Brennan Parks Fields and Lands, this phase 1 project, which is under the GICB grant, which is 20.5 million. This is on time, on budget. We're looking for a construction start imminently in the next few weeks here. We've actually started to remove some of the trees where the customer admin building is going to go. So we've actually physically done some stuff on site there. Again, there's a bit more construction jargon here. I'll open it up a little bit. We've signed the agreement with the grant supplier, which was a big milestone to make sure that we work through this project with them. Then that says ISIP signed. That's meant to be the IPD contract with the project team is signed. So that is my typo. I do apologize there. And again, that was another major milestone. So we've locked in the construction team, and we're talking about pricing here, which is always a sticking point internally. We've locked their price in under the IPD structure. We're working through building permits as well. So we split this project into 3 areas for building permits. There's not one for all of this stage. We've actually split it into 3. The first of that 3 is in, and we're working through this stage, the second building permit at the moment. And we've also, staff have reached out to user groups to get input on design. An example is working through with the ICE user groups and specifically getting, where should the hockey holders go, where should the hooks go, and we're really getting down to the design and getting some community input of the reality of the users who are using this facility. The next steps is to prep the land. Like I've noted, we've started. It's an internal, we call it a DS meeting, is to meet up with the all departments internally as we work through the building permits here. Again, continuing our user input and community engagement, and then starting construction. Hurdles, as with standard construction, there's no red flags here, so to speak. We're making sure we align scope and budgets are in line here. For the fields and lands, sorry, for the second grant, this one's still in limbo. This is the ISIP grant for $14 million. The scope of work for this one is the exterior wall of Brennan Park. This is purely to drive down the carbon use on the building and to drive down energy costs. We're anticipating an answer on this one late last year. We have our hands tied. We don't know when it's coming, but it has moved through the process, which is positive. The splash park and playground, it's over time currently, but it's on budget. And the reason it's over time is staff have opened up a couple of options here with the actual way that the splash pad is created. Typically what happens with splash parks is they use potable water. The problem with potable water when you come to, it's 36 degrees and we have water restrictions and there's concrete that has water flowing over the top of it, and yet the community can't, wash cars or water their landscaping. We're looking at alternatives here. So we've opened the timing up here a little bit. The alternative is to use a recirculating system. That increases costs. We will be coming back to council in the next short term here to explain the ramifications of that, but there will be some decisions to be made on what we're going to do here to move forward. And again, we'll be coming back to council there shortly on that one. For the trail that is anticipated to go from the building, from Brennan Park Recreation Centre to Finch Drive, we've moved that to next year because the amount of work that we've got focused on at Brennan Park at the moment, we don't feel that that's a critical item within the whole scope of projects that we're working on, and moved it over. The covered bike park, the onus is on the proponent and not staff at the moment, or district staff currently. For the pre-development work, and just an overview of the pre-development work, we have the same architect who's working on the stage one of Brennan Park. They're looking at an overview of the building. They're looking at an overview of the stages and how they go with the grants fitting into each other, how it works with the splash pad, the playground, the field house, and just how things flow together with parking as well. So we've moved this date. We're anticipating pushing the project team to get it done by the end of July. We're now moving that to the end of December this year. The reason for that, it actually allows us to do a better job. In a nutshell, we'll have more information and we'll get more critical information coming out of this master planning. It doesn't affect any of our other projects down the line, which is another reason why we've moved it to the end of this year. So covered structures, this is in the farmers market in the park, just next to the parking area downtown here. And again, just a heads up, this is a project update for Q1. So this one's now finished. It's complete. The general contractor's moved off site. This was done on time and on budget. There's a few little minor additions to be put in there, such as handrails, but overall it was a successful project when looking at time and budgets. The Squamish Adventure Centre, the construction proponent is on time and that's complete. The reason that this is orange at the moment on time is because we're waiting for some further feedback for the graphics from the Squamish story. And this is more of the digital side and the marketing side rather than the construction side. There's also a second grant work planning underway. The Junction Park washrooms, we delayed this purposely from last year because the costs were coming back high. We've revisited this one, and just a note that the Junction Park washrooms are still operating. I think they operate from, I think it's 8 o'clock to 5:30 on a daily basis. The proponents, we've actually just gone out to an RFP. We've gone to the market. We have a new designer to help us with redoing some of the interiors there, and we're working through that process. The idea is to still stay with us in this $365,000 budget. Overall, in the grant funding, just in a nutshell here, so we have 2 that are approved, 2 that have been applied for. The 2 that have been applied for is the ISIP, which is a $14 million grant for Brennan Park, and the other one, which is the a $10 million ask for fire hall number 2 there. Again, both of them are moving through the process. We don't have any final information if it's a go or no go, but they have taken the next steps into the process, which is good. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Questions? Mayor Herford, and then.
Thank you. Thank you for the update and all the work. There's an amazing amount of work of projects underway. we received council received a question from the public recently around, and you mentioned it briefly in your presentation around the trees at the entrance to the pool. And I know that that's the one space where the footprint of the building will be changing. But when will that? I know that these changes are can often be jarring to the community, as we see. It used to be a nice tree and now it's gone. But when will the next? Can you speak to the timing of that? When will we see further works there? What necessitated the timeline just right now? I just want to understand that, I think the fear is that, is that just going to be an empty space for too prolonged amount of time before construction starts there? So could you speak about that construction, that spot, and just what the timeline is for next steps there?
Through the chair, that's a good question. So we started the community update process with the open house that we had a couple of months ago, and that was to state what is happening when and to manage the community's expectations for this particular site. We will be giving further communication via signs on site, and also pointing to QR codes to have immediate updates on the website to see what's going on when. So in this particular instance, as noted, we've put in for building permit for this first portion of the works. The trees had to be removed, and it was strategic timing for bird nesting season and make sure we have a minimum impact on the environment here. And there were 2 ornamental trees. But so the work has started, and then we're following up this work in the coming weeks, which is part of this first building permit, which was the ice rink change rooms. So there's a date, there's a time, we've got everything that's on there, and it's very specific. And the communication will be via, again, site signage via the website, and we'll be doing the relevant PR communications as required.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Happy to hear that. You mentioned the delay of the trail from sort of the north-south trail through Brennan Park. And if I remember correctly, there was another project in the budget around relocating the road to the turf field that was in the budget. Can you just speak to the timing of that? And I guess does that fall under where does that fall in all of this? I was surprised to hear the trail delay there and not discussion around that piece, which I understand is delayed as well.
Yeah, that project actually doesn't fall under Cal Engineering is looking at that, and they are right now looking at how they are going to prioritize that with all their other engineering plots, and they're working right now with operations and really I think what was approved last year was a trail. They want to look at the thing holistically, which is not a trail, but a driveway, a parking lot, and then the trail to the turf thing, and how they can make that all work together. So they are actually talking about that as we speak.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. With respect to under the Brennan Park's master planning pre-development works report, with respect to satellite recreation needs, I was wondering if there are particular facility types or programming categories that will be or are being targeted in that effort regarding examining satellite opportunities.
Through the chair, that is a simple question for a very deep answer required. I think starting with, we don't know just yet. We have an initial thought process. We need to go through this. I mean, one of the things we need to do is update the recreation master plan as well. And we're working backwards a little bit. So we have an idea, but the whole reason we've got the architects on board now is to see what's going to fit at Brennan Park. Can we fit the pool? Can we fit the wellness centre? Can we fit the ice rink? Can we fit all these things, and making sure that traffic doesn't impact neighbourhoods significantly, and that it is a recreation centre that is super functional. The answer is we just don't know, and we're working to that process, which is exactly why we've got the architects on board for this master planning to give us those answers. So we have some rough answers now, but we'll have a specific answer by about December, November this year.
Thank you. Secondly, in the same section, there's reference to review and discuss project with Squamish Nation. Could you, Mr. Bragg, discuss in general terms what types of issues or fields would be discussed with the Squamish Nation with respect to the Brennan Park pre-development works?
Through the chair, we register every single one of our projects through Squamish Connect, which is making sure Squamish Nation knows what we're doing. In this particular instance, it is a community-facing building, and we reached out to Squamish Nation to update the proposed works, but mainly also to start a relationship and to seek feedback on what we can do for opportunities for Squamish Nation, for specifically for arts, culture, for heritage, and really just get information from the Squamish Nation on what in the design now, because we're actually very, very early stages in the process, and we have an opportunity now to inject items very early, which makes it a little bit cheaper and more possible in the overall project's scheme.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor French.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks for the update. Very helpful. The splash park we see is now 3 months behind schedule, and there's many families that are watching this one very closely. When we last talked about the project, the expectation was that it could be operational this summer. So I'm just would like to know on behalf of families, is this expected to be in use in 2024?
Through the chair, in short, no. And we've made that decision to move it into next year now because of the environmental impact of the water use. And again, I think there's a lot of other splash parks working through this within BC. Are they going to use potable water, or are they going to use a recirculating system? And even then, the recirculating system, it still needs 20% of potable water. And the other issue here that we've delayed it for is we do have a well on site, and we're trying to work out what part of that 20% we can then interact that into the system as well. So we're trying to minimize the water impact. We do apologise, but we've got to focus on the environment as well, because once this thing is in place, it's inset. You know, Whistler's one's been there since the early 80s, so we've got to get this right from the get-go.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for being straight. Landfill waste reduction is something that we see a bit in this report, and I appreciate the effort that our staff has taken to reduce the amount going into our landfill through the projects that we're doing that involve demolition or deconstruction, as the case is. And I have a worry that the private sector isn't really picking up where we're leaving off. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about what staff is doing to ensure that private sector involved in deconstruction and demolition are seeing what we're doing and seeing the example that we're setting to have them follow.
Through the chair, this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I can say one example of how we've set an example, which was Firehorn number 1. I think we went in not knowing if we could achieve a 75% waste reduction, and I think we ended up at 80, don't quote me, but it was over 80, it was like 84, 85%. So if the government can do it, we did it internally, and it was relatively straightforward as well. And I think that we've set this one example. I'm not sure how that is fielding out to the industry.
I'm looking at Mr. Stoner because I feel like he might have something to contribute to this. If not, then I'll move on to my next question.
Through the chair, Councillor, sorry to disappoint. That's a great question for our sustainability team, and they're not here to answer that question. So,
yeah, okay, fair enough. Now I'm also looking at all that we have happening on the public works site, and I see that the salt shed at the north end of the property has been disassembled. And that has me then worried about, what about salt as we go into the next winter salt road season? So could you update us on what's happening with the longer term picture for that particular structure at Public Works?
Through the chair. So initially we had 2 salt structures. We'd moved one off-site almost just over a year ago now. That's moved to just south of the airport there. So we still have an operating salt base. This one was the secondary base, and it's been removed. Now, obviously, winter's been complete, and it will be re-erected again. We're anticipating on the same site, within the same site, before winter hits for 24-25 season.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor Stoner, and then Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair. The master planning project for the site and building locations at Bennett Park says that it will now be delivered in Q4 as opposed to Q2. I was wondering if you can clarify if that delay is impacting the splash park delivery, if we're waiting for the results of that planning document.
Through the chair, no.
And then this may just be my poor recollection, but I am certain that the initial pitch for the splash park included an 80% recirculatory system. And I'm just wondering if that has changed.
Through the chair, that may have been miscommunication from our side, from staff side. The typical one doesn't have that, but maybe it was we're looking into a recirculatory system. The unfortunate thing is the $1.8 million budget that we've allocated does not include a recirculatory system, and they're expensive. And this is what we're going to bring back, the pros and cons and ramifications of moving to a recirculatory system in the next few months here to council to consider.
Thanks very much. Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, just sort of noting that the presentation on the recirculating system will come to us. I just want to caution, I'm not sure it's my priority to do this so that people can wash their vehicles and water their lawns. I think I might have different priorities, and so, there may be other things to consider. I just want to, I didn't catch, I think you said the Junction Park in the summer, the hours are going to be 10 until when?
Through the chair, I think it was 8 till 5:30 for Junction Park washrooms.
8 till 5:30. Okay. Now I'll just note sort of over Easter weekend, and I'm not sure if that has started yet. That was not my experience, and so maybe that's something to connect with our teams on. Are people with events able to extend that, or is there a process? And I'm just thinking of some of the smaller events that the BIA does where Johnny on the spots don't make sense. And I think Amped in the Park, I just got a notice about planning for that, and that often goes till 10 in the evening by the time teardown is done. So are there times when that will be extended or can be?
Through the chair, the difficulty with Junction Park washrooms is the times were set based on staff resourcing and also vandalism. We'll have to look into that further to answer that question.
Okay, thanks. And I understand it's a little bit off topic of this presentation, but I did want to flag, I think that's going to be an issue and seemed to be an issue over Easter weekend too. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any further questions? No, and this presentation was just for information, so there are no staff recommendations. With that,
I'll just move receipt.
Oh. Mayor Herford moves receipt. Councillor French seconds. Any opposed? None opposed. Motion carries. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, staff. Mayor Herford?
Motion to close.
Thank you very much. Motion to close. Looking for a seconder. Seconder by Councillor Anderson. Any opposed? None opposed. So we will close and recess for 10 minutes for staff to lunchtime, 2:15. We're okay. So we will recess until 2:15 to have some lunch.